Okay, hello and good day. Welcome to those of you who've just joined us. We were just giving everyone a moment to join us in the session, but I think we have a good size audience now to get started. So, hello again, everyone, and a big thank you and welcome to joining us in today's training workshop on managing and reporting on nature. So, firstly, a big thank you on behalf of myself, Fiona Quinlan Wells, for joining us in the workshop today. And of course, a big thank you to all of our partners on this programme, to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, to the UN Development Programme, to ICI, the International Climate Initiative of the German government, and of course, a big thank you today to the team at the Philippine Stock Exchange for hosting this workshop with us. So with that, I'm very pleased today that we're joined by the President and CEO of the PSE, Ramon S. Monzon. So a big thank you for being with us here today, Ramon. So I'm just going to hand the floor over to you now for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Distinguished partners from the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD, and the International Climate Initiative, and the United Nations Development Programme, esteemed leaders and representatives of publicly listed companies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasant afternoon to you all. On behalf of the Philippine Stock Exchange, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to this vital learning engagement dedicated to managing and reporting on nature. While the PSE has long championed sustainability, this marks our very first partnership with the UN SSE, specifically focused on nature. We believe this conversation is both urgent and essential for our capital market. As one of the most biodiverse and resource-rich nations on Earth, the Philippines has a unique responsibility and opportunity to be at the forefront of managing nature-related risk and opportunities. This afternoon, we will dive deep into how businesses can evaluate their impacts on the environment and effectively report on them using the TNFD recommendations as the strategic guide. Our ultimate hope is that our listed companies view the TNFD not merely as another compliance checklist or burdensome reporting framework, but nature is intrinsically tied to financial performance. The sooner we recognize that ecological health is financially material, the faster we can build robust internal systems that minimize ecological risk while sustainably maximizing the resources available to us. Given our country's vast natural wealth, sectors such as manufacturing, food production, agriculture, mining, and tourism possess immense potential for growth. However, long-term business resilience dictates that these resources must be utilized sustainably. It is no secret that our ecosystems face critical threats from deforestation, rapid land use changes, and poaching. By properly managing our environmental footprints, we safeguard the continuity of our operations and protect the well-being of the communities we serve. Indeed, as our speakers will highlight this afternoon, nature risks are no longer abstract future threats. They manifest directly in our supply chains, operational costs, and bottom lines today. By embracing these disclosures, we do not just protect nature, we future-proof the Philippine economy. Thank you, and I wish you all a highly productive and insightful session.
Thank you so much, Ramon, for that great start to the session. I think, as you say, great to highlight already the real relevance of this topic for companies and financial markets. So, thanks again to you and the team at PSE for all you're doing to advance this subject and many others in the sustainability sphere in your market. Fantastic. Well, great. Well, with that, everyone, we'll get going with a few practical points to get the session started before we dive into the content side of things. So, firstly, just a few practical points. You'll have noticed by now that as participants, you are muted in the session. So, just to say, that doesn't mean we don't want you to interact with us. So, please do make use of the chat and the Q&A to contact us. So, you can use the chat if you've got any general comments that you'd like to share with us, any observations on the content or any reflections from your own perspective. If you have a particular question for the team, it would be great to put questions into the Q&A box. That way, we'll be able to track and answer your questions directly. So make sure to use the Q&A box for any questions for us, which you should have available to you at the bottom screen on Zoom as well. In terms of our format for today's training session, we've got a live 3.5 hour session together today. Hopefully, you had the chance to watch the 30-minute pre-watch video that we shared with you in advance of the workshop. You can access that if you haven't already watched it from the event webpage that you signed up for today's session from. So we'll share that link with you a number of times in the chat as well. As I've already mentioned, the great feature I think of this workshop is your ability to ask your questions live and get responses in real time. So make sure to use that Q&A box if you've got questions for us. We'll also really encourage your participation in today's workshop. So we're going to use a number of interactive features, including a tool called Mentimeter, which we'll share the link to in the chat with you shortly, so you can already join us in Menti. But do make sure to take part in those interactive exercises, as they're an important part of your learning today. And then finally, if you do take part in the training, you're also able to receive your certificate of participation. So we'll share the details of how to get your certificate at the end of the workshop. But main thing you'll need to do is fill out the feedback survey that we'll share with you towards the end of the training. So another important point to highlight is that you can download all of the materials from today's training workshop from the event webpage for today's session. So thanks, Tiffany, for just sharing that in the chat now. So if you follow the link to that page, you'll be able to download the slides that we're going to be presenting to you as a handout. And that includes a number of extra hidden slides with further detail and context. We also have there the model guidance on nature-related financial disclosures that we've developed to accompany this training. So highly recommend to check those resources out. And just to confirm as well, that's the same page where you'll be able to watch the pre-watch video that I mentioned, if you want to see that again. And also we'll add the recording of today's training workshop to that page after the session as well. So in terms of today's live workshop, there's a few key things we're really hoping to help you work through and achieve. So firstly, we'd like to help you to be able to explain why nature is relevant for your business and really understand that topic. Then we'd like to move on, and just to confirm, that was the element that we covered in the video in advance of the session as well. So we'll recap some of the key concepts today, but if you want to go more in depth, recommend to check out that video. From our live workshop today, in the second half of the screen there, you'll see we've got three key objectives. So firstly, to be familiar with the resources that are available to support management and disclosure on nature. Then also to understand how to identify, assess, and manage nature-related issues. And finally, to think about identifying who requires this information and how you can best integrate it into your public disclosures. So really the what, how, and the who is what we're aiming to work on today. So to help us with that, we've developed a 4-module structure to our training program. And this follows the same structure that we used in that nature model guidance that I shared with you. So if you've had a look at that guidance, you'll be familiar with that flow that we're going to work through in the content today. So firstly, when we start on module 1, we're going to be thinking in understand, as we call it, about the different context and principles behind nature. So as I've mentioned, this was covered in the video, but we'll recap today what nature is and what the business case is for acting on it. In module 2, align, we're going to be really thinking about how to set the direction behind your approach. So thinking about what the TNFD is, what its framework and guidance comprise, and how the overall ESG landscape of disclosure requirements is connected to that. Then in our third module, implement, we'll really start getting into practices and systems. So in particular, we're going to work on how to get started on embedding nature into your organization, in particular by undertaking a leap assessment, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the workshop and explain more about what that is. And then finally, we'll finish our session today by talking about communications, of course, a really important part of this journey. So, thinking about how to engage your stakeholders on this topic and how to report to investors, looking at examples of best practice there as well. So that's our structure for today. And just to show you how the time we'll spend in the session breaks down, this is the timings of our different segments. We spend a little bit of time on our recap of the first module. We'll then work through the new modules, as I've mentioned there. We'll take a 10-minute break around the middle of the session to refresh ourselves. And then we'll make sure we leave plenty of time at the end to wrap up, share some additional resources, and hopefully have a little bit of time to wrap up on any questions we haven't had chance to talk about yet. So, to cover who's going to be presenting for you in today's training, you'll be pleased you're not going to hear just from me for 3.5 hours. We've got lots of different presenters today who'll be sharing their expertise with you. So, as I've mentioned, I'm Fiona and I'm joined by my colleague, SSE Academy Head Tiffany Grabsky. Hi, Tiffany. We're also very pleased today to be joined by Fiona Pederboy from the TNFD team. Hi to Fiona as well. Really appreciate you being here with us as well. And alongside us a little bit later, I think we have Valentina here already, and we'll have Joseph joining us a bit later. We have our guest speakers as well from the S&P Global team. So Valentina is an ESG client engagement specialist, and Joseph is the director for climate and sustainability services. So big thank you both as well for joining us to share your perspective. And another, I think, important element of today's training is the company perspective. We know, of course, that hearing from individuals who are in organizations that are adopting the recommendations already can be really valuable as well. So, to augment our perspective today, we've brought in the videos that we've recorded of an interview with Harshal Limdi, who is the general manager at JSW Group, an Indian based steel company. But I'll really let Harshal introduce himself to you now in our first video clip, and then we're going to come back to him a number of times throughout the workshop today. Great. Sorry, Tiffany, just need you to play the video from your side. Thanks. It seems, you maybe know, but we don't have sound, unfortunately. Great. We'll just give Tiffany
Sorry,
a second.
Fiona. I'm just trying to figure out what it might be.
No problem. Sorry about this, everyone. We had a slight problem before the workshop on mine, so it's last minute we had to change to Tiffany. So I appreciate you didn't have a chance to get things set up. Maybe just try resharing and sharing in case that magically fixes it. But if not, we might have to come back to Harsh a little bit later. No worries if so.
Sorry, I think we might be best to just continue.
Sorry, Tiffany. I just realized I was on mute. Sorry, I was trying to say, yeah, like, if we can just share the
Okay.
slides, we'll come back to that later. Sorry about that, everyone. Thank you, Mercy, who pointed out in the chat that I was muted. Sorry about that. Yeah, we'll come back to the videos if they can work for us a bit later. I can also try from my side a little bit later, Tiffany, and see if that works. I think PowerPoint might be working again now. But to move on with the session, what we're going to do now, we'll aim to introduce Harsh a little bit later, who will hopefully be able to come back to a few times in the training. But what we're going to do now is just to get an understanding really of where you're at on nature. We're going to do a little bit of an exercise shortly to go through some definitions with you. But the first thing we'd like to do is just to run a little bit of a poll to get a sense from everyone what your current understanding and familiarity is with that link between nature and business, which is really we're going to be focusing a lot of our time and attention today. So you can use that rating scale that you'll see on the Zoom poll if you've got that window open. From 1 to 10, I believe the scale is, or 0 to 10. Let us know where you think your current understanding is at, with obviously 1 or 0 being right at the beginning and maybe a 9 or 10 being completely expert on this, already know everything. So let's see. I see we get lots of responses coming in. I think I'm going to end the poll there and share the results just to keep that quick. But it looks like so far most of you have indicated a 7 or 8 actually. So it looks like lots of you have already been working on getting nature progressed as a topic in your organizations already. So that's fantastic to hear. I know some of you are maybe at an earlier point as well by the looks of it, so no problem at all if that's the case. But yeah, great to see lots of you think you've got some understanding already on this topic. So we'll do a bit of a test and see throughout the session how much of that you can really put into practice. But do please feel free to share during the training your perspectives, because it'll be great to see what you're already doing on nature if this is something you've already moved forward in your organizations. Okay. So, as I've mentioned, the next thing we'd like to do is really start by ensuring we're clear on some of the key definitions we're going to be using in our training workshop today. So, to help us with that, we're going to use Mentimeter to have a go at getting some of these definitions, because we know that having that in front of you and having a go at guessing it, it's much easier to have a go yourself than necessarily just see a definition on the screen that we read to you. So, I'm going to now just share a different screen with you to show Mentimeter. That's going to show you a number of ways that you can join us in Menti. We'll also have a chat link that we'll just share with you in a second, which will give you the same information as well. But whilst we're waiting for the link, the things that you can do as well is you can use that QR code that's visible on the screen there if you'd like to join us on your phone. And you can also thanks, Tiffany. You can also go to menti.com and enter that 8-number code that you're seeing at the top of the screen as well. So hopefully a good number of you have joined us in Menti. We're going to move on to the first question. I think I'll be able to keep the QR code available there for you on the side of the screen as well. But our first question is just to ask you, how would you define nature? So feel free to share a few words that come to mind for you to summarize what you think this definition contains, or maybe just a few keywords. So you don't have to have a full definition, but of course, if you do know, feel free to share that as well. But really, as we said, there's no expectation here that we necessarily have the right answer. It's just about having a go and seeing what we think of so far, making sure we're all clear. Great. So big words I'm seeing so far is life, environment, biodiversity, the natural world, ecosystem services. Great. Okay, loads of the right concepts coming through already. Resources, uh, best and only business. That's a nice way to put it. Organic and inorganic things as well. Lots of great thoughts here. Sustenance, limited. Super. Thanks, everyone. Well, I think it's clear. I think you've got lots of good thoughts on this question already. I think there's loads of the right sorts of words coming up here already. We're going to look at the official definition in a moment. But before I do, a second one just to test with you. So we talked about biodiversity there. And I know that some of you actually mentioned that as an element of nature already and how you define nature. They are slightly different terms. So we're going to go through the definitions in a moment. But how do you think biodiversity would be defined, and maybe how would that differ to nature? So someone said that biodiversity is nature, so maybe you think they're the same. But I see as well some people mentioning a keyword here: variability, variety of living life, the diversity of species. Absolutely, I think lots of good concepts there that are getting at the right element of what biodiversity might be. I see flora and fauna, ecosystems as well. Thanks, everyone. Lots of great responses. And that also was a good test to make sure we could all access Menti. We're going to be using Mentimeter a few more times later in the session. So recommend keeping the tab open that you've opened now, and we'll come back to this again. But let's go back to the slides, if that's okay, Tiffany. And we're going to have a look at the official definitions here.
Fiona,
Oh, yep. We are still getting a bit of an echo, Tiffany, just to let you know. You might be hearing that too, but just to give you a heads up. Great, thanks, Tiffany. So, thanks for all of those great responses, everyone. I think you already had a lot of the right terms here, but just to recap from the TNFD perspective before we dive in. So, the TNFD definition of nature is based on the definition from the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. So, this definition is really placing an emphasis on the living components of nature. The TNFD framework focuses particularly on these renewable or living elements. However, non-living things, resources, and also I heard someone mention inorganic things, which could include perhaps, minerals, energy. These are considered, but only to the extent that they would affect the health of living nature. So the natural world and all the living organisms is really the focus. And then the second element that we discussed there, so nature is really the broad concept that encompasses all naturally occurring, living and non-living components. Biodiversity, though, is a more specific term, and it's considered a characteristic of nature, specifically relating to the variability among living things. So, exactly right for many of you who mentioned that term variability or variety. So, to think about this another way, you could also think about nature as a large, healthy forest. Biodiversity would be seen as the variety of life within that forest. So, the different species of trees, the animals, the fungi, the microorganisms, and the soil, even, that all comprise the variability of that nature that is the forest. So, if we think that nature is the element here that provides the space and the resources, biodiversity, so that variety of the species, is really what helps to make the forest system resilient and functional. It allows it to resist diseases, cycle nutrients, and adapt to change. So, if you lose too much variety or biodiversity, then that whole system, nature, is going to become vulnerable. So, although we sometimes might think of nature and biodiversity as interchangeable, they are a little bit distinct here. So, it's important to keep that in mind because it is a useful thing to think about as we move through the training today. So, thanks for Tiffany for sharing a link there. You can also access the glossary from TNFD, which contains these definitions and definitions to many more different terms as well, if you'd like to look at that in more detail. But to get us started on the next segment, we're going to kick off now with a bit of a recap on Module 1. I'm just going to check, Tiffany, if your sound is coming through okay.
can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we're good. Great. Thank you for that. And as I said, I'm
I'm
sorry, pass the technical problems over to you
Yeah,
today.
sorry everyone. We've had quite the morning this morning with the many computers we're using. I'm gonna quickly try the video because I may have got it sorted and then we'll know if we can use them for the remainder of this session. But let's just quickly see if we can meet partial here. No, no sound. Okay, Fiona, so maybe for
I'll have a look at that. I
future
might
ones
be
you
able
want to
to.
share your screen and then
Yeah.
but in the meantime, I'll get us moving forward. Oops. There we go. Okay, so hopefully now we're all acquainted with, I'm sorry, the screen's not moving now. Great. Hopefully now we're all acquainted with the basic topic we're talking about. And I hope you all watched the video in advance, but let's do a quick preview or a recap, let's say, just in case you missed something from the video. So in the first unit, we look to build really a solid foundation. And what we covered in the video was why nature matters, why it's critical to act on this particular topic at scale, and what businesses should know about nature, the key considerations to get started in understanding the topic. And to round off this section, we're going to finish with a further unit in today's live workshop on the investor perspective with support from S&P Global. Great. So let's start off with a quick poll here. So the question is testing one of the first concepts that we introduced in the video, and it's how many of the 9 planetary boundaries have we already breached? Now, you might remember in the module, we introduced this concept of planetary boundaries, and this is a framework that scientists use to understand the environmental limits within which humanity can operate safely. So think of these boundaries as the Earth's life support system, the systems that keep the planet stable, predictable, and habitable. We're getting the majority of you saying 7, a few saying none, a few saying 4, and some of you saying all 9. So I'm going to end the poll now with more than half of you and congratulate all of those, more than half of you that picked 7, which is indeed correct. So in 2025, a scientific assessment showed that 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries had already been transgressed. And what's important to highlight is that climate change is actually just one of those planetary boundaries. That's why we talk about looking at nature beyond climate. We need a much more integrated perspective, one that recognizes how biodiversity, land use, freshwater, nutrient cycles, and many other systems are interconnected. And we need to act with real urgency because these systems are already under significant stress. We also talked about the fact that multiple ecosystem services are in decline. Ecosystem services are simply the benefits we get from nature, things like clean water, fertile soil, food, pollination, protection from storms, and even the regulation of our climate. So the leading global scientific body that assesses these trends, IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in 2019 warned in its global assessment that many of these ecosystem services are declining around the world. Oops, sorry, for some reason, Fiona, the slides are only working from the slide computer, so I'm moving them from there now. Great. So let's look now at another key thing we covered in Module 1, and that is that every economy in the world ultimately depends to some extent on nature, and by extension, so does every business. At the moment, a lot of the value businesses extract from nature isn't fully priced into business valuation. Water, clean air, fertile soil, stable weather, these are all essential inputs. But companies often don't pay the true cost of using and also damaging them. So why does this matter? Well, because fundamentally, business and nature are systemically interconnected. Businesses rely on nature to operate. We call these dependencies. At the same time, businesses affect nature. We call these impacts. So the diagram here is how the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, represents this relationship. On the left, you can see that nature and the services it provides interact, and on the right, you see business. The arrows show a two-way flow between these. So business depends on nature, and the actions impact nature in return. And when you put those dependencies and those impacts together, they translate into risks and opportunities for companies. And this is why it's so important to recognize that nature is not just an environmental issue, it's actually a core strategic risk for organizations. And what this means is that nature risk is indeed financial risk. So the future cash flows of business, whether they are incorporated into your organization's flow or not, need to be considered. It's an opportunity as well, and an opportunity doesn't always mean investing in something brand new. It can be as simple as applying what the business already does in a smarter, more sustainable way. These opportunities can deliver benefits both by reducing negative impacts and by creating positive outcomes for nature. So for example, as customer expectations shift, companies can access new markets or locations, maybe by responding to growing demand for nature positive products and services. So keep in mind, while nature loss brings real risk, it also opens the door to innovation, efficiency, and new markets and stronger, longer term resilience. So let's do another quick quiz. Another important thing to remind ourselves of is the different aspects or realms of nature. These are different components that the TNFD uses to define what is part of the living natural world. So select all the options on the list that you think are correct. Which of these are the 4 realms of nature? So in theory, you should be selecting 4 of them. Just give you a moment here. We have atmosphere, we have ocean, we have fire, we have fresh water, we have society, and we have land. Great. So more than half of you have participated in that. So I'm going to share the results, and congratulations to most of you. So as we can see, if I pop up the diagram here, the TNFD's framework is based on 4 realms: land, freshwater, ocean, and atmosphere. Now, many of you also said society, which is maybe a bit of a trick because that lies at the center of all 4 realms. So you might remember seeing society in this diagram in our module 1, and that's because it really, connects to all 4 of these realms. But the core 4 realms are those that many of you selected there. So good job. Let's do one more poll here. So in the second part of module 1, we focus on outlining some of the key things that businesses should understand about nature when getting started on this topic. So these statements here all relate to specific aspects of nature that are important to understand, but only one of them is correct. So which do you think is correct? The first one says nature issues are the same for everyone and they should be tackled using a global approach. Second is that nature risk is connected to other risk types. The third is nature and climate should be approached separately. And the fourth is people and nature are 2 separate things and should be treated that way in risk management. I'll give you 5 more seconds to put your answer in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great job. More than half of you participated. I appreciate that. And very well done. The second one, the majority of you picked that one, nature risk is connected to other types of risk, is correct, but all the rest are false. So let's maybe discuss why those are false. So our first option in that poll indicated that nature was the same for everyone. Well, climate change is a global process and with one shared atmosphere. In contrast, as we discussed, nature and the drivers of nature change are actually location specific. So businesses' nature-related dependencies and impacts on nature, which lead to risks and opportunities for businesses, are highly location and context dependent, shaped by both the sector you work in and the geographical footprint. So organizations need to consider sensitivity alongside the locations which present material nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities in their organization to filter and prioritize. The second one here relates to the second option B that brings us to this second phrase: we face interconnected landscapes of global risks, often in surprising or unexpected ways. So what is clear is that nature-related risks connect to and amplify other corporate risks. The next poll option suggested that nature and climate should be separate, but as we learned in the video, businesses' response to nature and climate must actually be integrated because they are 2 integrated topics. There are 5 impact drivers of nature change, including climate change, as well as fresh water, ocean use change, resource use, and invasive species and pollution. So climate change and the resulting increase in global temperatures is a driver of nature degradation, and the increasing frequency and intensity of flooding, wildfires, and storms can disrupt the water cycle. It can alter the soil temperatures and accelerate habitat and wildlife loss. But keep in mind that nature degradation also drives climate risk. The destruction of forests can accelerate climate change by increasing carbon into the atmosphere, and the destruction of wetlands and mangroves that provide protection against flooding can reduce climate resilience. Now, number 4 there relates to the final option we had in the poll, which stated that nature and people should be addressed separately. But what's important to have clear is that people are part of nature, not separate from it. People, especially indigenous peoples and local communities, rely on nature for their livelihoods and can play a critical role as stewards in conserving and restoring ecosystems. Also, corporates and financial institutions cannot address nature acting alone. Great. So with that, we're now going to move on to the last unit of this module. So we've talked about the business case and the market case for nature-related disclosures and some of the key concepts to understand when getting started. Now let's consider which stakeholder groups are interested in data and disclosure from businesses on nature. As we've been discussing, nature is increasingly shaping business strategy, risk, and opportunity. And as that happens, stakeholder expectations are also rising rapidly. One particular stakeholder group that this applies to and will be relevant for many of you joining us today from listed companies is indeed investors. Investors want to understand how nature risk can affect returns, credit worthiness, and long-term value. So to help us get started on this topic, I'm so pleased to have with us Valentina today from S&P, as Fiona had introduced at the start. She's going to guide us through the investor and financial angle on nature and why it matters. And Valentina, I recognize I've not given you slide control, so I will do that just as you start talking now.
No worries. Thank you so much for the introduction and thanks for joining today's workshop. Thanks to the UNSSE and the Philippine Stock Exchange. So the aim of the next couple of slides is to start really thinking about what these impacts and dependencies look like, which were covered in the previous slides, and how can we help not only kind of identify, but also assess and manage those location-specific nature-related risks. So based on S&P Global's 1200 study, the ecosystem footprint of the top sectors is equivalent to 32 million football pitches of the Amazon rainforest that are being impacted. So this staggering figure really highlights kind of the immense pressures that leading industries place on some of the kind of most biodiverse and ecological significant regions in our world as well. So with these kind of staggering figures that we're looking at as we confront the significance of those ecological footprints of those major industries, it really becomes increasingly clear that, innovative kind of financial solutions are essential to be able to help foster those sustainability and also mitigation strategies for nature-related risks as well. So in this slide, what we're really examining along the kind of impacts and the nature dependencies risk, but also the impact metrics alongside the S&P's World Index cumulative index performance. What we've seen from kind of backtesting performance is that low to high dependencies rankings, right? So there's a kind of variation of what is categorized from the low to the high. Companies basically with the lowest kind of nature dependencies or nature dependency risks as measured by scores outperformed the S&P World Index, while those with the highest nature dependencies of risk underperformed. So this really kind of highlights and brings home the story of the financial relevance of managing those nature-related dependencies of companies as well. So when we talk about those impacts and dependencies that have also been kind of highlighted, as the impact of climate change also becomes a lot more material we're seeing day to day, it is also increasingly important to recognize how does nature play a part in that, and how is it part of the equation, especially when we talk about the energy transition, right? So this data here that we're looking on this slide, it's looking at mines in the following stages of, for example, development or operational, looking at late exploration and early exploration. Closed mines are excluded from this study, but we're seeing from the commodities, so looking at minerals such as lithium, we're looking at cobalt, we're looking at nickel, we're looking at zinc. These are all essential for the technologies that are really driving to that low carbon transition. So as global demand of these minerals keeps accelerating, keeps increasing, this therefore means that these mining activities are therefore expanding into regions that are not only just mineral rich, but also very ecological significant. So showing kind of the part that both play. So the thing to really think about here is that as nature-based equivalent of carbon footprint, so we're looking at it's basically, yes, as I said, the nature-based carbon equivalent, carbon footprint equivalent. It really measures the environmental impact of the company's operations by also calculating what area of the ecosystem is actually being significant where these activities and operations are being carried out. So essentially, in other words, it shows how much of the of nature, of natural land, and of the habitat is being impacted by things, by business activities such as mining for that kind of route to the green road and that transition to the green road as well. So we're just going to ask a question here to get you thinking. As mentioned, when we're talking about key biodiversity areas, what that means is that these are specific geographic areas that are very critical for the conservation of biodiversity. So these are basically identified. Key biodiversity areas are identified based on their importance for the persistence of biodiversity, including species, ecosystem, and those ecological processes. So our question here, which is great that some of you have already started asking, but what percentage of companies from the S&P 1200 have those operations overlapping with key biodiversity areas? Great, so let's try and get up to 50% of participants and then I can wait. So we've got a majority of percentage kind of going between 60 and 79%. Okay, almost at 50%. Perfect. I will end the poll there and share the results. So what we've seen here, I think the majority of you, around the 20% did 70 to 79% and 22 from 60 to 69%. So the answer is, and congratulations, I think 20% of you answered it, was that it's actually 71% of companies of the S&P 1200 have operations in those key overlapping areas. I think that should load. Yes, there we go. Key overlapping areas as well. So when we think about the impact of it, it also goes hand in hand as kind of we were speaking in the earlier slides. It goes hand in hand with the dependency side as well, right? And we have to consider that aspect of nature too. To remind ourselves what that dependency aspect looks like, that second pillar, it looks at the interaction between the level of reliance of the on the ecosystem services, but also the ability of that ecosystem to maintain those operations and sustain kind of that continued flow of those services. And yes, of course, everyone is dependent on nature, but here what we really wanted to highlight from kind of our studies for the S&P 1200 is that 57% of the S&P 1200, some of the world's largest companies, face really like a big significant dependency on risk of nature across their direct operations. So where we define dependency risk as the combination of high dependence on ecosystem services that are at risk. So given the criticality of kind of nature and the dependency on it, we must start to ask ourselves, so why are so many companies still falling short given their commitment to biodiversity? So according to the latest S&P Global Corporate Sustainability Assessment, which we refer to as the CSA, the majority of companies worldwide do not actually have a public biodiversity or policy commitment. So this gap really is especially pronounced outside of leading regions and sectors. So with significant variations across those geographies, and industries, which is what we're highlighting here on this slide. So for example, when we're looking at Latin America and Africa, there is a highest kind of share of companies with biodiversity commitments kind of leading at the top there. But then while regions like the Middle East and North America kind of lagging behind. When we look at the sectors, we see that utilities and energies sectors are most likely to have policies in place, but most other sectors remain kind of far less engaged. So basically overall, only a quarter of companies globally that are undertaking the CSA, that corporate sustainability assessment, have made biodiversity a formal part of their sustainability strategy. So highlighting that there is still a lot more that we can do with that. So, nature and biodiversity also impacts ESG scores. So, nature and biodiversity really significantly impacts environmental, social, and government scores as they are basically an integral component on the environmental criteria within the ESG framework. As you can see there, along with things like climate strategy, water, packaging, waste pollutants, etc. So, what we're seeing is that through that, it really reflects a company's environmental performance. Not only that, but also the risk management capabilities and also the commitment to sustainability. So, organizations that prioritize biodiversity is, one of the metrics that we see here in our environmental pillar of it all, are more better positioned to enhance their ESG ratings and therefore kind of meet a growing expectation for investors and stakeholders, which, what was mentioned by Tiffany is that these are core kind of strategic risk for businesses as well that have to be considered and not neglected. So just to kind of summarize what we've been through. So increasing relevance of nature for capital markets. Also, when we're talking about the climate transition, it is very much linked to nature and biodiversity. We looked at those kind of overlapping KBAs as well. And also that companies are directly exposed to nature related impacts and dependencies, where we saw kind of those staggering values or percentages for the S&P 1200 study. Another thing is that to consider is that companies are not fully prepared for these risks and opportunities. So it's through things of understanding kind of those TNFD frameworks to really perhaps help companies feel like they're prepared in following that journey. And last but not least, what we covered in that last slide is that ESG scores are linked to kind of those transparencies and performances on biodiversity and how it impacts those ESG scores as well. I think I'll pass it back to Fiona, or maybe Tiffany, sorry.
It was me. Thanks, fantastic, fantastic,
No.
Valentina. Uh, Sorry, a bit slow on my side. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I think that really helps to bring things to life. So great to have that input again. I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but maybe you can just keep a quick eye for a few minutes in case any come up. So if anyone did have any questions for Valentina, do feel free to share those. But otherwise, we'll move on then and wrap up the modules. So we're going to have one last go now at seeing if we can get the sound to work. Thanks everyone for bearing with us here. So we'll just quickly see if this is what playing along with us now since it's not been cooperating. Okay, we have sound. That's great news. I think whilst we're here, oh, sorry, Tiffany.
I was just congratulating you.
We got there in the end, yes. Thanks for all the help. Okay, so I think what we'll do is, since we're on this video now, I'll introduce Harshal. We're going to play another video from him within the next module where he'll talk a little bit about his experience. But as I've mentioned, this is just his quick intro to explain who he is and his organization.
Hi, my name is Harshal Limdi, part of JSW Group, heading Environment and Biodiversity Vertical from the corporate. JSW Group has very strong presence in steel, energy, paints, automotive, and cement sector. We are having our headquarters in India, and our group turnover is around 30 billion US dollars. So that's about me.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks everyone for bearing with us on that. And apologies, things came a little out of order there, but we'll come back to Harshal, as I said, in our next module. Great. So to kind of summarize then from our first module, we're going to just recap on a few key takeaways. So, firstly, I think the main one to get across is that every business depends on nature. So, this isn't just about farming or resource extraction industry, for example. I think what we're really hoping to show you today is that all sectors and regions of our economy and society rely on nature to some extent. So the bottom line is because of that universal dependence, nature is a topic that every single organization really needs to understand and address seriously. We also want to highlight that nature isn't an isolated issue. So Tiffany took us through those points about its strong interconnection with other societal issues. Nature-related risks can very easily connect to and amplify other major corporate risks, which really makes the global risk landscape highly complicated. And then the final thing to highlight here is all around investor interest in this topic. So Valentina took us through there, a great presentation talking about that financial relevance of nature-related issues and how it's being factored into assessments of companies and ultimately investor decision-making. And all of that is leading to greater demand for disclosure from companies. Great. So hopefully we're all now feeling refreshed on some of those core concepts from Module 1. As I've said, if you didn't already watch the video or you want to refresh on a few of these things again, you can find the video that talks about all of this in more detail on the event webpage. You can also find the slide presentation from that video as well if you want to go through any of the slides and look at those resources in more detail. But to get us going on Module 2, I'll pass us back to Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. So let's move on to module 2. And in this module, we'll move on to considering the frameworks and the guidance that's available to support companies in making nature-related disclosures. In order to do this, we will look at 3 key concepts in this unit. So the first one will introduce the TNFD and its adoption by the market. Once we cover that, we will also discuss how to use the recommendations and the guidance provided by TNFD. And finally, we'll explore how the TNFD then aligns and supports other reporting standards and frameworks. So to begin, let's focus on understanding more. Oops, sorry. Let's see. Maybe, oh, sorry, I moved too far then. Sorry, I'm already on Fiona's slide, but we're going to move on to understanding more where the TNFD comes from. And to do that, I'm passing over to our Fiona from TNFD. We have a heavily led Fiona team today. And thanks so much, Fiona, for being with us. Over to you.
Thanks, Tiff. Hi, everyone. Great to be here, and thanks for joining the workshop. I'll just provide a very brief overview of the TNFD. So the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is a market-led science-based initiative with the mission to develop and deliver a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report and act on evolving nature-related issues. The task force provides companies and financial institutions with recommendations and guidance about how to incorporate nature beyond climate into their decision-making and provide a globally recognized approach to assess and disclose nature-related issues. So there's a few extra slides as part of this handout. We won't go through them today just for time, but they cover TNFD, how TNFD was developed, its history, and why organizations are using its recommendations. So we encourage you to look at those in your own time. Maybe next slide. In terms of TNFD's relevance, in September of 2023, after 2 years in design and development, the TNFD finally launched its final recommendations for nature-related risk management and disclosure. And it really builds and aligns with the work developed by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures with the intention of allowing for integrated reporting. The disclosure recommendations and guidance encourage and enable business and finance to assess, report, and act on their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, enabling nature to, again, really be integrated into decision-making processes, encouraging organizations to view nature as a strategic risk management issue and an opportunity. So the TNFD recommendations are designed for organizations of all sizes, across all sectors, and along value chains. They are relevant to a wide range of market participants and market enablers, as we show on this slide. And it's really been designed to help organizations address nature-related issues within their specific contexts, and is very much relevant to multiple audiences. We'll later on discuss a little bit more and dig more into the 14 recommendations that the TNFD has developed. Next slide, I think. Sorry, I could probably change it actually. No, it doesn't seem to be working from my side. Thank you. So a few key insights from the TNFD's 2025 status report. So in September of 2025, the TNFD released its first status report showing significant market uptake of the TNFD's recommendations and guidance. So some key findings include that 78% of those companies that have already reported have integrated the presentation of their climate and nature reporting. 63% of companies and financial institutions surveyed for the report believe that nature-related issues are significant, if not more significant than climate-related issues, to the future prospects of their business. So while we recognize that the assessment of nature-related issues remains new and is perceived to be complicated, this report really highlights what's possible with the use of existing metrics and by building on existing internal capabilities. As of November 2025, there are 733 TNFD adopters worldwide. This marks a 46% increase in market commitment to TNFD-aligned reporting since the CBD COP16 in Cali, which took place in November of 2024. And drawn from 56 countries or areas, including 26 emerging markets and across 64 of 77 SASB 6 sectors, the publicly listed companies now represent over $9.4 trillion in market capitalization, which is an increase of 44% since November 2024. 179 financial institutions are now underway with TNFD-aligned reporting, representing $22.4 trillion in assets under management, marking a 27 increase from COP16, including 25% of the world's systematically important banks. So all very encouraging information and data. I'll pass back to Tiff for the next section. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona. That was a really good overview of all the hard work actually that you and your team have done. So thanks for being here to share that. Now, since this module is about making use of global standards to keep you on the right track, let's take a bit of time to walk through what resources can support you and how you can best use the TNFD recommendations moving forward. Now, let's start off with another Zoom poll. So this helps get a sense of how many of those joining us today are already familiar with using the TNFD's materials. The very first person that entered their response said yes, and we're reporting on nature. So congratulations to those companies that are already starting this journey and reporting on nature. Hopefully you can also share some of your experiences in the chat with us so that the other participants get a sense of maybe how you're using the TNFD materials. Some of you say that you're familiar with the materials, but you haven't reported it yet. Some of you are saying, no, not familiar with the materials at all. And some of you actually have no idea. So that's a good spread we have here. I might end it there so you can see the results. It looks like the majority of you are not familiar with these materials. No problem. That's why we go through them. But those of you who are familiar with these materials, as I said, please do feel free to share your experience in the chat. Ask any questions. If you're struggling in any parts of it, that's what we're here for today. So please feel free to share your comments, questions, and thoughts with the rest of us. So with that, I'm going to move on to get started on the materials that you can access. So I think it's important to be clear that the TNFD is not simply 14 recommended disclosures, which might be what you've heard of so far. So there's much more to it to that. So before walking through those 14 recommended disclosures, we firstly wanted to make sure that you understood the context and additional resources that collectively should guide your final disclosures. So there's a lot of concepts on this slide, and I won't go through in detail every single box that you see here, but I do want you to understand how these different concepts and areas support each other. So let's start on the bottom of the slide with the conceptual foundations, which are like a set of principles that help you to understand how the recommendations were designed. These principles include the basis and approach to materiality used by the TNFD, the comprehensiveness of identification and assessment of nature-related issues that's expected by the TNFD, and the expectations for increasing the breadth and depth of disclosure ambition over time. But put very simply, these four concepts on the bottom of the slide really help clarify what expectations and basic definitions underpin the guidance given on what companies should disclose on this topic. So it's very helpful to be familiar with those concepts. Next, these four conceptual foundations then create the base for the 6 general requirements. Now, these are all general aspects about a company's approach to nature-related disclosure that provide really the key contextual information needed for investors and report users to best understand the full disclosures. Therefore, these 6 general disclosure requirements then go further and create the base for the 14 voluntary recommendation disclosures, which are grouped into these 4 categories: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. So hopefully that makes clear how you can use these conceptual foundations to understand the recommendations between the general disclosure recommendations and the voluntary disclosures across the 4 content areas. But let's dive a little bit deeper into those disclosure requirements. We'll start with the TNFD's general requirements. And as I just mentioned, the purpose of the general requirements is to provide that context for the more detailed 14 recommended disclosures. So these 6 requirements help ensure consistency and comparability across reports from one company to the next. One note to keep in mind is that these 6 general requirements should actually be used in addition to the general requirements of the ISSB's, the International Sustainability Standard Board's IFRS S1 standard. So if an organization chooses to state publicly that it is using or aligning to the TNFD recommendations, it's expected to apply these 6 TNFD general requirements as well as the 5 ISSB general requirements, which have also been developed to create very clear, consistent, and decision-useful context for the IFRS's S1 disclosure. So these general requirements apply across all those 4 pillars of the TNFD's recommended disclosure that I just mentioned. I won't go into each of these general requirements individually, but I do want to flag one in particular. So if you are familiar with the IFRS sustainability standards, you should actually be comfortable with most of these concepts included here. However, one of the general requirements that I think is quite specific to the discussion related to nature is particularly number 6 on this slide. So engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. So this requirement really recognizes that people closest to nature often hold essential knowledge and are most affected by nature-related decisions. Organizations are expected to describe how they engage with these groups in a meaningful and culturally appropriate way. And I wanted to flag this because you will see momentarily that there are also specific disclosure recommendations within the 14 recommended disclosures that relate to specific aspects of engagement activities with these groups. But since this is a general recommendation as well, it is applied to all 4 of the pillars of the recommended disclosures. And that means that engagement with these groups should be addressed in all areas of the recommended disclosures. And make sure to make use of these general recommendations because together they create the backbone of TNFD-aligned reporting, and they ensure that disclosure is transparent, that it's comparable, and that it's importantly grounded in a really robust process. Now let's dive into those 14 recommended disclosures. So these are the disclosures you might be most familiar with. These disclosures are organized across 4 pillars, which mirror the structure many of you will recognize from the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and then transposed into the ISSB standards. So first, there's governance. This pillar focuses on how the organization is governed with respect to nature. It includes disclosures about board oversight, about management, and then also about engagement activities, as I was just talking about. The second pillar on strategy is where the organization explains how nature affects its business model and its strategy. The third pillar on risk and impact management describes the process the organization uses to identify, to assess, to prioritize, and to monitor its nature-related issues. And then the fourth pillar on metrics and targets recommends that organizations disclose the metrics and the targets that they use to measure and manage nature-related issues. And this pillar really shows how performance is being tracked and managed over time. So together, the 14 individual disclosures across these pillars give stakeholders a clear picture of how an organization is governing, planning, managing, and measuring its relationship with nature. They also support consistency with global reporting frameworks, which we'll talk about later. Now, remember that each of these should be employed with those 6 general requirements that we just talked about. But now let's go into each of these with real examples. I think that helps make it clear. So let's look first at an example. This one's going to come from Swire Properties, their 2024 climate and nature-related financial disclosures. And we'll look at how some organizations are approaching the TNFD governance recommended practice. But as a quick overview, under the TNFD governance pillar, organizations are asked to describe 3 things. They're asked to describe the board's oversight of nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. They're asked to describe the management's role in assessing and managing these risks, these issues, and any relevant human rights policies, engagement activities, including oversight of engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. So with that in mind, here's the Swire example. So we can see several components here. So first, they outline how the board of directors sets and approves strategic direction on sustainability matters, including climate and nature-related issues. And this helps understand the board oversight. Next, this disclosure sets out the role of the ESG steering committee and various working groups, which illustrate how management reviews risks, develops strategy, and monitors progress against KPIs and climate and nature. And finally, the example shows several policies which together indicate the organization's stated commitments and frameworks that support engagement and oversight, that last component. So for example, you can see here there's a policy on human rights and other key areas. So this example has some aspects for all the 3 recommended disclosures under the governance pillar. Now, we've included a second governance example here from Japan Airlines, which is available for you to review in the handout, but for the sake of time, we're going to leave that for you to review on your own time. Now, let's go into strategy, the second pillar. As a quick overview, under the TNFD strategy pillar, organizations are asked to describe 4 things. First, what are the nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, we might say DIROs, that have been identified over the short, medium, and long term? The second is, what are the effects that nature through these DIROs may have on the organization's business model, value chain, strategy, and financial planning, as well as any transition plans or analysis being used to determine this. Third is how resilient the strategy is when considering different scenarios and assessing nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And then finally, what assets or activities are located in locations that are considered to be priority locations when it comes to nature sensitivities. So looking for these things in this example comes from Robeco, which is a pure play, or I think it's Robeco, sorry. It's a pure play global asset manager and leader in sustainable investing. And as you can see on the left side, let's just make that a little bit bigger here. They have provided in their integrated annual report here 2 donut graphs illustrating the amount of assets under management in their portfolio that have high or very high impact or dependency on biodiversity. And this introduces the dependencies and impacts identified in their portfolios in particular. This also, however, sets the scene for the second image here, which I'll also make bigger for you, which shows the main steps to their biodiversity investment framework. Robeco evaluates how well companies are addressing biodiversity loss and differentiates between leaders and laggards in their portfolio. Furthermore, they have indicated in their report elsewhere that starting in 2024, they're using this framework to guide their investment decision-making, which helps report users understand how the impacts and dependencies then influence Robeco's strategy. And we've also included a second example in strategy from OG Group, which is again available in your handout. And we highly recommend you take a look at those additional examples in your own time. Now let's look at the third pillar. So under TNFD's risk and impact management pillar, organizations are asked to describe three things. First, the processes used to identify, assess, and prioritize those DIROs, both in the company's direct operations as well as in its upstream and downstream value chain. Then the processes for managing those DIROs, and finally, how these processes are integrated into and inform part of the overall risk management practices. So as you may have noticed, this section is all about processes, how our risk management unfolds. Because of this, we often see a narrative description explaining those processes. But let's look at an example here from AMEA Power's 2024 TNFD report. AMEA Power is a solar technology and project developer in the UAE, and I did see we had a few participants from the UAE here today. Now, this table here is quite useful to see a quick summary of the risks, implications, and management of risk, as well as the identification of opportunities. As you may remember from our example on strategy, it's actually in the strategy pillar where we have guidance on disclosure recommendations related to the identification of and the effects we see of nature-related risks. But here we also have the management and mitigation of those risks. So understanding the processes of risk management here, providing real examples to add color to the processes that the company describes. For example, we can see in this table that the company conducts a biodiversity action plan to protect and restore habitat and to mitigate the risk of impacts on threatened species. Now let's look at the final pillar with one more example here. So under the TNFD's metrics and targets pillar, we're asked to describe three things: the metrics used to assess and manage nature-related risks and opportunities, as well as the metrics used to assess and manage nature-related dependencies and impacts, and the targets and goals used to manage and measure performance on nature. So here in this example, we can see, as a continuation from the AMEA Power example we already introduced, a table that they have to list the metrics they're using. As you can see here, there are some metrics that are under review, and there are others that have been provided already. And this provides a good overview of the types of metrics we might see. But just to note that a table like this is not enough alone to fulfill this recommendation. What we also need to see here is how these connect back to those dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, or DIROs that have been identified, and what the starting point was for that metric. What is the associated target or goal, and how do we plan to achieve that goal? Just to flag another quick example here related to the general requirements we were talking about, one of them was time horizons. So for all of the disclosures we discussed today, understanding the time horizons we're working with is really essential. And like this company has done, these time horizons should make most sense with your business cycle and your supply chain. So this company uses 0 to 3 years as short term, 3 to 10 years for medium, and 10 plus for long term. But others will actually use different time horizons. What's really important is that you actually explain what those time horizons are and that they make sense for your company. So like this company did here. Now let's take a moment just to unpack how, now that we've got those 14 recommended disclosures kind of in our mind, how all the additional guidance from the TNFD works with this. So the TNFD indeed recognizes that nature is complex and that the way nature affects an organization can vary hugely depending on the sector or the biome, for example. So because of this nuance, TNFD offers guidance specifically for certain sectors and also for specific biomes. So sectors include, for example, financial institutions, metals and minings, etc. And biomes include forests, grasslands, or rivers, for example. Importantly, this guidance is really designed to be flexible and practical. So you only need to review and use the parts that are relevant to you. You shouldn't be reading all of these documents. These guidance documents then help you to interpret and apply those recommended disclosures specifically for your location and sector. Now, in addition to the sector and biome guidance, TNFD also provides materials that support the full set of recommendations for any sector or any location, including guidance on the LEAP process. And this is a practical step-by-step method that TNFD has developed to help organizations to identify, assess, and prioritize nature-related issues. And we'll discuss that in our next module with an activity. There's also guidance on value chains, and there's guidance on engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders, which we'll explore further on in this training as well. Then there's also specific guidance for particular pillars. For example, there's a scenario analysis guidance, which helps support strategy disclosures in particular by helping organizations explore how different nature futures or possibilities in the future could then affect their businesses. Also, there's guidance on metrics and targets. This is included in sector guidance metrics, and there's also information on setting science-based targets for nature. So altogether, this package of additional guidance is designed to help organizations move from simply disclosing information to actually really managing nature-related risks and opportunities in a structured and forward-looking way. Now, before we wrap up this unit, I wanted to come back to engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders, which I brought up with you when we discussed those general disclosure requirements. So as we've already seen, the TNFD's general requirements and recommended disclosures ask that organizations describe different aspects of the engagement with these particularly important groups. In addition to this, there's also a dedicated guidance on engagement to support organizations, which aims to provide practical information and support organizations on engaging. And we'll share that in the chat so you have direct access to that. But in addition to this, as you can see on the slide, there's also an important guidance found on this topic in your guidance for specific sectors. So for example, the TNFD sector guidance on financial institutions states that they need to work with the corporates that they support or that they finance to ensure that they are undertaking the necessary engagement activities using best practice approaches. So you can see all of these guidance documents are really designed to be used together, to be used flexibly, and according to the unique circumstances of your particular organization. So where do you find all of this? It's a lot of guidance, no? So to get started, I really recommend coming to the TNFD Knowledge Hub. This is really the central home for all TNFD resources and supporting materials. And if you're looking to deepen your understanding or support others within your organization, the Knowledge Hub is really a fantastic place to explore. You can also find the UNSSE's model guidance on nature-related financial disclosures on this hub, where you can also dig into expanded version of all the key areas we discuss in our training today. But now let's go back to those market voices. Now that we know we can actually hear them, let's hear from Harshal at JSW about how using the TNFD recommendations and guidance has benefited their organization. And anyone already using it, I encourage you to share your own experience in the chat.
We are now focusing on quantifying positive or negative impact of our interaction on nature. And currently we are exploring how do we build the cost associated with this positive or negative impact while making investment decisions. So we are trying to put a number, financial number, in terms of the positive or negative impact on nature. So consider the internal carbon price. So we are trying to put or develop similar kind of structure to consider this nature related cost in the investment decisions.
Great. So hopefully that gives some perspective of exactly the benefits you're seeing there. now we have explored kind of what the TNFD is and how to make use of its resources, but let's move on to understanding how that connects with the broader ESG disclosure landscape. And for that, I'm going to pass back to Fiona at TNFD to take us through the next unit.
Thanks, Tiff. So, as I walked through earlier, TNFD is a market-led task force that provides recommendations to enhance nature-related risk management and corporate reporting. It's really important to note that TNFD is not a standard setter, but the recommendations are intended to be drawn on by standard setters like the ISSB, GRI, the ESRS, as they develop themselves topical reporting standards focused on issues of nature and biodiversity. So the TNFD is aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework at the international level. The GBF's Target 15 calls on governments to put in place requirements for corporate reporting of nature-related risks, dependencies, and impacts by 2030. So there's over 190 governments that have committed to introduce corporate reporting requirements related to nature by 2030 in Target 15 of the GBF. So the TNFD really, its recommendations and guidance are designed to enable the goals and targets of the GBF, specifically this Target 15. So I'll say a little bit more about interoperability and TNFD's guidance. So the development of TNFD recommendations and additional guidance have contributed to the ongoing development of nature-related disclosure standards. The TNFD's multi-year collaborations with sustainability standards bodies have resulted in a high level of consistency in the nature-related information recommended to be disclosed by corporates and financial institutions. The TNFD has worked really closely with standards bodies to harmonize concepts, definitions, and approaches, ensuring that organizations can report on their nature-related issues in a consistent and comparable manner. This really helps to streamline reporting processes across a range of topics. And I'll walk you through a bit more of the various standards and the work we've done. So starting with the ISSB, or the International Sustainability Standards Boards of the IFRS Foundation. The ISSB drew strongly on the work of the TCFD in developing its S1 and S2 standards, and there is close alignment between the TCFD and the TNFD. For example, the TNFD includes the same 4 pillars and carried over 11 recommended disclosures and added 3 new recommended disclosures, which are specifically or particularly relevant to the nature context. So a more recent development is that in November of 2025, the ISSB announced its intention to undertake standard setting on nature to introduce incremental disclosure requirements. So in April of 2026, the ISSB decided its proposed form of standard setting on nature would be a practice statement, a form of standard setting with the full effect of an IFRS standard. This is intended to give nature-related disclosure requirements more visibility and prominence, whilst also to minimize disruption to the substantial implementation effort already underway on IFRS S1 and S2. So the ISSB is targeting having an exposure draft of incremental disclosure requirements ready by CBD COP17 in October 2026. So in response to this, TNFD announced that it will complete the technical work it currently has in progress by the third quarter of 2026, and will then pause any future technical work from Q3 of 2026, but noting, importantly, the capacity building work from the TNFD will continue. ISSB's chair, Emmanuel Faber, has encouraged market participants to continue using the TNFD framework. This will help report preparers prepare disclosures in accordance with IFRS S1 and prepare for meeting future incremental ISSB disclosure requirements. He's also highlighted that the ISSB IFRS S1 standard already covers general requirements for disclosure of information about an organization's sustainability-related risks and opportunities, which could include nature. So moving on to look at the ESRS standard. Let me just check. This is the one. The TNFD guidance and disclosure recommendations are consistent with these standards. So the scope of the assessment includes all of the ESRS environmental standards beyond climate, so E2 to E5, sorry. For organizations wishing to disclose under both the ESRS and the TNFD, we've developed this correspondence mapping document, which you can see on the slide, and it's a really helpful starting point. ESRS requires companies to conduct materiality assessment on environmental topics beyond climate, which include pollution, water, biodiversity, and ecosystems, as well as circular economy, and states that the LEAP approach can be used for this activity. So the LEAP approach can inform both the TNFD disclosure recommendations as well as the ESRS requirements. And currently the ESRS is going through the final stages of its review as part of the European Commission's Omnibus Simplification Initiative, and we should hear more by the end of the year, or before the end of the year. Finally, I'll move on to the GRI. So the Global Reporting Initiative, we also, with the GRI, developed a report that looks at both the key alignments, but also the differences in approaches. For example, the GRI only focuses on impacts, while the TNFD also looks at dependencies, risks, and opportunities. As part of this report, we have an interoperability mapping, which illustrates how the TNFD recommendations and metrics align with the GRI's environmental standards. So this is a really good document if you want to understand more the alignment between approaches. I'll move on to saying a little bit more about TNFD's approach to materiality. So the TNFD has a flexible approach to materiality, which allows companies needing or wanting to apply either financial or double materiality lens to report in accordance with the TNFD recommendations. So TNFD's recommendations have been designed to be relevant across jurisdictions and the different approaches to materiality now in use. The disclosures recommended by the TNFD do not stipulate whether organizations should take a financial or impact materiality approach in their public disclosures, but instead the recommendations are designed to be flexible and can be applied through different materiality lenses. So if you're taking a financial materiality lens, you need to meet the information needs of capital providers consistent with the ISSB IFRS standards, with a focus on risk management and how dependencies and impacts on nature create risks and opportunities for organizations' financial position and prospects. Now, if you're applying an impact materiality lens, you need to meet the information needs of stakeholders, focus on impacts, align with a broader materiality approach, reporting against both ISSB and the GRI or ESRS standards. So when companies are assessing, they should consider the material information needs of their stakeholders, the standards applied in their industry or region, as well as the regulatory requirements in their jurisdictions. So that's a little bit more on the reporting landscape, as well as TNFD's maturity approach. I'll hand back to Fiona. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Fiona. Fantastic for that. That's great to get an overview of that. And I can see you've had a few questions in the Q&A on this topic as well. So obviously something people are interested in. So hopefully that was helpful to bring that to life a bit more. And we've shared all of those different mapping documents just there. So this is going to wrap us up now on our second module. You'll be pleased to know we're about to take our break shortly, but before we do, we'll just consolidate, I guess, some of the key things we've covered in this segment. So firstly, TNFD really gives us the roadmap here. The disclosure recommendations and the supporting guidance are really all designed to empower businesses and financial institutions to systematically assess, report, and act on nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So it's the framework that's been designed to translate nature issues into business strategy. And as we've heard, this is a market-led and it's a scientific approach. The TNFD's central mission is to support that critical global shift, moving financial flows away from activities that harm nature and towards those that benefit it and improve resilience. And as we've heard as well, it's globally aligned. And this effort directly supports the objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework, really all around integrating nature into the heart of financial decision-making. And secondly, as Tiffany walked us through, there's a real wealth of supporting material here that can help you. So the TNFD has developed an extensive range of resources that can work across different sectors, geographies, different types of nature-related issues. So although we know it can be a little bit overwhelming when you're getting started, the volume of guidance that exists, what it's really important to remember here is that it's designed to be used flexibly based on your specific needs. So the most important thing to know is that these resources do exist. So be sure to check out the TNFD Knowledge Hub, as we've mentioned, because it's really built to help you navigate and find exactly which resource is right for your needs and your organization type. And finally, as Fiona just walked us through there, the TNFD is designed to fit your existing reporting framework. It was developed to be applied flexibly and in combination with other major reporting standards and frameworks. So you can use the TNFD's materials to support your nature-related disclosures, whether you're using the ISSB standards, the GRI, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, and other frameworks as well. So to be sure to check out the resources that we've shared on that to get a better understanding of how to align with and respond to particular frameworks. Great. So we actually are doing well for time today. So I think we've got time for a few questions if we have a few coming in. So I'll have a little bit of a look at, I guess, some of the questions we've had so far. If there's anything in particular, I guess, from what you've heard so far that maybe is unclear for you, feel free to pop in a little bit of a question on that now. But I guess I know that one thing has come up a few times here is sort of navigating that element of mandatory requirements, maybe how to prepare for the potential for nature to come mandatory, but maybe operating in a landscape at the moment where that's uncertain or you're using other frameworks. So maybe I'll just turn to both Fiona and Tiffany. If you've got any reflections, feel free to come on camera here, but probably just any reflections or advice you might have for companies who are navigating that transition, maybe from the use of voluntary standards to the move towards mandatory reporting here and the adoption of international standards. Would you have any advice for companies as they're navigating that transition on how they can use their TNFD's materials in the interim? And maybe I'll come to you first, if that's okay, Fiona.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Tiffany. Obviously it's a large landscape. So I can understand that some individuals, organizations might feel overwhelmed by the quantity of documentation. But just to stress that the TNFD has really sought to create that alignment between approaches and thinking about organizations being able to use existing data they have to feed into the TNFD. We've obviously aligned with the TCFD to also help with familiarization of the different disclosures. So aligning to those 4 pillars, which should simplify also familiarization. And then when thinking about starting an assessment, you want to start thinking about scoping your assessment and starting small, because TNFD recognizes that the limitations of the data landscape, as well as limitations with knowledge of organizations with regards to the topic of nature. And so we recognize that disclosures might be small, but will increase over time as capacities build within an organization, as data develops, as well as methodologies on nature and biodiversity measurements develop. Yeah, I'll hand over to Tiffany if you would like to add something.
I think
Great,
that was a
thanks.
really good overview. Sorry, Fiona. I think that was a
No
really good.
worries, Tiff. I was just going to say, I think it'd be great to get your reflections, but maybe as a build on that, I see we've had a question as well, particularly asking around like the first steps on reporting and what you'd recommend companies do to get started there. So maybe that's a good build on how you might reflect on this point.
Sure, yeah, I can build on that too. I mean, what Fiona was saying about getting started, I think it's really important to just remember that this isn't about a box ticking exercise. And same with TCFD and then ISSB. The reason these questions and this push is coming from investors is because they're not interested in you just, filling in a questionnaire. They actually want to understand, are you prepared for these, new futures we now know are unfolding and the changes we now expect in the natural and environmental services and resources that so many companies depend on. So I think what the TNFD has done, which has really taken this to the next level of utility and usefulness to companies, is to really build out that LEAP process, which I guess I won't get into because both Fionas are going to go super into this with an activity with you later. But the kind of starting point of LEAP is really locate. L stands for locate. And that to me is key on getting started is not trying to, list every natural service or environmental service or resource that you use and how it relates to you. I think it's really understanding what is the impact? What does your company specifically depend on? And if that resource is not available to you in 10 years' time and you don't exist anymore, how are you making sure you're foreseeing that? So it's really about your organization. So you should come out of this feeling stronger, feeling more sustainable, feeling like your company is prepared for any future that might unroll. I won't go any more deeper, Fiona, because I know you're going to give everyone a lot of information on LEAP, which will help everyone.
Super. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, indeed. I think that primes where we're going to be heading next after the break. So I see we are getting a few more questions in. So thanks everyone for these. I think what we'll do is we'll continue to pick these up and get back to you in writing. But just, I guess, to summarize, I see a few people asking as well around the timelines for mandatory adoption and kind of the interconnection with ISSB. So there's a few links that I can share with you that might be interesting to take a look at. The IFRS, I guess, tracks where all organizations are up to with mandatory reporting. And we also have, as Fiona took us through, the ongoing work of the ISSB to develop their nature practice statement. That statement draft is due to come out in October time. So obviously there's a consultation period that's going to need to happen on that draft before it becomes mandatory, and then we'll have to see jurisdictions take action to adopt that potentially as well. So there's a little bit of a time frame, I guess, to work through still to see how the mandatory picture will move forward. But I think the key point that was mentioned is that the S1 standard of the ISSB would already require you to disclose nature-related issues if you have material information to report. So getting started now with using these materials to support you on that is a really good idea, so that you're well prepared for when you're likely to get more scrutiny on this from investors as the work advances. Great, thanks everyone. So let's take our break now. We've got 10-minute break, so we're going to play you a timer. Hopefully there'll be some music to relax, but feel free to take a break away from your desk, get a drink, etc. And we'll regroup when the timer reaches the end point. If you do have any more questions as you're taking your break, feel free to ask those, and we'll get back to you as well as we move through the next segment. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you again shortly.
Great. I hope everyone had a nice break. Hopefully, you got to stand up, do a quick stretch before we dive into the second half of today's training program. So up to now, we've outlined the TNFD recommendations and guidance and how they support companies to identify, assess, and manage those nature-related dependencies, risks, impacts, and opportunities. But now let's look a little bit more practically at how this is done, starting with the practices and processes needed to conduct your assessment of nature-related issues. Now, in this unit, we will cover 3 topics that are key to progressing action on nature. Considering where to start in assessing nature-related issues, really discussing those questions we had in the Q&A, then delving into the TNFD's LEAP approach that can support this. And to finish with, we'll discuss a practice case study exercise with S&P to bring this all to life. Now, to kick us off with this unit, let's firstly look at the steps organizations may wish to take at the outset when getting started on nature. Now, first, let's understand a bit better what it means to embed nature into an organization's processes. So to successfully embed nature into our corporate processes, we must begin by changing our mindset. The starting point needs to be a clear understanding that nature is essential to our business. It's not just an environmental concern, it really underpins everything from our supply chains to our long-term stability. So once we acknowledge that fundamental importance, we need to get a bit more granular. So we must delve deeper into what the specific dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities are that truly affect our organization. What exactly do we rely on? Where are we having an effect? And what are the resultant risks and opportunities to our organization? Now, these critical insights can't then just sit on a shelf. The next step is really non-negotiable. These findings will need to be integrated into our existing risk management and strategy development processes. If a nature risk is, in fact, material, it must inform our strategy, just in the way a financial risk or a market risk would be integrated. So to achieve this integration, we need broad buy-in and action. So an organization-wide approach is required here. I want to be clear, this is not just a sustainability issue. It involves finance, operations, product design, and procurement, for example. Therefore, we need to identify the teams and the business areas that must contribute to this work and those that will own the outcomes across the company. So finally, to cap this off, successful execution really requires structure and accountability. So we should establish initial governance over nature to help guide and drive these actions consistently throughout our business. And this governance structure is what will ensure we move forward from assessment to impactful, lasting change. So the disclosures and actions you eventually report on are really just this tip of the iceberg you see here. All of the crucial foundational work we've just discussed, the identification, the integration, the governance, and organization-wide engagement is the massive amount of work hidden beneath the water that makes the public-facing disclosures successful. So to start on this, it's important to bring together the right people and throughout the organization to bring the right teams together. And this sometimes can be challenging. So let's hear again from Harshal to hear how their company dealt with this.
I think the most important lesson for us is to use the language which operational team understands. For them to see the value in this whole exercise. How this whole TNFD framework is going to help us run our plants better, avoid maybe future pains, uh, should be the language we should try and speak. Now, for example, asking simple questions like, what what can stop our production lines, or what causes community complaints, or what causes legal notices, or what has caused delay in getting the approval for our expansion project, etc. I think uh, these kind of conversation will help us to get more insights from the employees and the stakeholders who we are involving for this whole framework implementation.
Great. So really speaking the same language between teams is really important here. So before we dive into that LEAP approach that I said helps you take that first step forward, we want to understand how familiar you are with the LEAP approach. So how familiar are you with TNFD's LEAP approach? Maybe you're using it already. Maybe you're not using it yet, but you have heard of it. You're aware that it's there and available. Or maybe you've never heard of it at all. There's no wrong answer here. We just want to make sure we understand where the majority of you are at as we discuss this approach with you. I do see that at least two of you are already using it. So again, those of you who are already familiar with the concepts we're discussing today, I think everyone can benefit from you sharing your experience. So please don't feel shy to share in the chat, your learnings or maybe even what you're struggling with, and we can discuss that. But I see that there's a few of you who are quite familiar with it but aren't using it yet. And the majority of you, I'll share the results here, actually have never heard of it. So we'll make sure to start from the start, make sure that it's familiar to everyone. Great, I'll move on now to the next slide. I think it's just a bit slow. It should come momentarily. So on this next slide, I think let's introduce at least where we're going here. So this one is discussing the embedded approach, which requires an understanding of nature. So first and most crucial, the first step to successfully integrating nature into your organization is getting a clear understanding of the nature-related issues that are both relevant and material to your business, as we were talking about earlier. So the TNFD recommends using this LEAP approach as the starting point and to build this understanding internally. It's really designed to be very flexible and iterative. So meaning you can adapt it and build it as you require over time. So what exactly is the LEAP approach? Some of you have never heard of it, so let's go through it. Well, it's TNFD's methodology for the identification and the assessment of nature-related issues. That's really making it your own, right? Which is so important getting started. So it provides really structured guidance across 4 phases to help you understand your organization's nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. It's really designed to be used by an internal project team within your organization to conduct an assessment of these issues. Now, after an initial scoping phase, which you can see a lot along the top there, there's 4 core phases. The first being locate for L, your organization's interface with nature. So where do your operations, your value chain, and other activities interact with different ecosystems? Second, E, evaluate your dependencies on and your impacts on nature. So understanding how does nature support your business and how does your business affect nature? Then assess. Assess your nature-related risks and opportunities that arise from these dependencies and impacts, really pulling that into what's the impact on your business and your strategy and how you operate. And then finally, prepare. Prepare how you're going to respond to this now that you know it. How do you respond? How do you report? Understanding your material nature-related issues and aligning with the TNFD's recommended disclosures. So LEAP really builds on existing frameworks like the Natural Capital Protocol and Science-Based Targets Network, or SBTN methods. And I think what's really important here is engagement is really cross-cutting component of the LEAP approach, informing all of the phases. So the complex interplay between an organization's own dependencies and impacts and those of others in society really underscores the need for engagement, again, with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders across corporate value chains. So if you already have a nature assessment in process, you can use LEAP as a sort of checklist to ensure it aligns with the TNFD's recommended disclosures. And crucially, you don't have to disclose everything identified in LEAP. Remember, this is meant for an internal team. So when it comes to disclosure, you'll apply only your chosen materiality approach. Let's hear more about how Harshal is using LEAP to get that perspective again.
So before engaging with TNFD recommendations and LEAP approach, we primarily viewed nature-related risks through a compliance and operational lens, such as water availability, land acquisition, and environment clearances. While these risks were managed individually, the broader dependencies on surrounding ecosystem were not fully assessed in integrated and forward-looking manner. So a key blind spot identified during this whole LEAP process was our dependency on shared water resources and land ecosystem beyond plant and our mine boundaries, and that too particularly when we have our operations in water stress region. So this whole LEAP structured approach help map against sensitive watersheds, forest areas, biodiversity hotspots around our operations, and thereby revealing how ecosystem degradation can directly impact our resilience, so to say. And by shifting focus from impacts, which was the case earlier, we are integrating dependency, risk, and opportunities through TNFD, and translating nature-related issues into business-relevant risk, I think, and then strengthening our enterprise risk management program and learning how do we allocate capital and decision making, keeping in view the nature related risk.
So with that, let's now dive into LEAP, and what better way to do it than with an activity. Let's make everyone do it on their own. Well, not on their own, I guess. The Fionas will guide you through it, but I'll pass back to both our Fionas to take you through this next part.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. Yes, we'll try not to leave everyone alone, but as you say, we think probably the best way to help you understand this assessment tool is to really have a go at it. So that's what we're going to be doing now in this next segment, and really working it through. So what we'll be doing is switching back to Mentimeter again. So you should have the link in the chat to Mentimeter. I'll share my screen in Menti now as well so that you can join us using the options on screen if you haven't done already. And we'll get going. Oh, sorry. There we go. You should just have the one screen available to you. Now you might have to click the tab at the top if it didn't appear for you. But just to recap, Tiffany's already walked us through an overview of what the different components of LEAP comprise. But just as a reminder, what we're really aiming to do in this exercise is to work through each of these different phases of LEAP to really understand what happens in practice in each phase, how a company would actually use this, and really hopefully to demonstrate how flexible and iterative this approach is. So what we're going to be doing now is a simplified version of LEAP, which is really kind of intended to help you get to grips with the basics and get a feel for what activities occur at each phase. But we should say, of course, that it's not intended to be a full and comprehensive overview of the entire process. And we're going to signpost more resources for you where you can dig into that after the session further as well. But recapping a few of the key points about LEAP. So LEAP is undertaken by an internal assessment team. So for the purposes of the exercise we'll do now, you should place yourselves in the shoes of being in the internal team executing LEAP. Maybe that's already your position, but if it isn't, let's have a think about that perspective. And LEAP has been designed to be used by both corporates and financial institutions, although the approach that they might take would be perhaps a little bit different. So to help us get the basics today, we're going to start by looking at a company example. But if you're in a financial institution, you might want to also be thinking in the background about how you'd apply these activities at a portfolio level. And you can also read more about that in the finance sector guidance that we've shared with you already. So a few things just to keep in mind is, of course, this approach we're using today is hypothetical and is just for illustrative purposes. But before we do, let's then dive in to think a bit more about the hypothetical company we'll be using for our exercise today, called FastBite. So FastBite is a major listed US fast food chain that sells all the usual fast foods, burgers, fries, and milkshakes that you'd expect. They've got outlets all across the US. And a really key part of their business model is reliance on a consistent, high quality, year round supply of their key inputs of beef, potatoes, wheat, and dairy. As you might expect, they've got a complicated supply chain sourcing products from the US and globally, with a particular focus on sourcing products from elsewhere in North and South America. Frostbite has already started to see a number of risks in recent years relating to nature. Firstly, they've experienced some climate and nature related disruptions. They've seen rising costs and reductions in yields of commodities due to extreme weather. They've had issues with invasive pests, pasta degradation in their supply chains as well, which have caused them some reliance issues on their suppliers. And secondly, they've also seen some negative reputational exposure to issues relating to deforestation. So they've had pressure from the media, from NGOs and customers about potential links between their business and beef suppliers in the Amazon basin. So they are really lacking visibility and traceability of what those issues at the moment. And so, really, to help them build their strategic response to these issues and to ultimately help them to build a better plan around this, the company is deciding to undertake its first leap assessment to better understand these issues and hopefully help it to build out its long-term approach to manage the risks and opportunities that it's already started to see, and maybe some of the new ones it might be able to identify as well. So let's work through now what the leap components could look like for FastBite. So the first stage, as Tiffany already mentioned to us, is scoping. So the purpose of the scoping exercise is to help us get a shared internal understanding of the scope of the assessment and the resources that are needed for it. So let's have a look at some of the key things that an organization might want to consider here. So, if we think about FastBite and what we've heard about their business so far, our first question for you is if FastBite wanted to understand how it interacts with nature, which of these aspects do you think they would need to consider as they're planning the scope of their assessment? So you can select as many of these options here as you think would be important for them to consider at this point, and as many as you think are relevant. You could kind of vote by putting, I think, your counters against them according to which ones you think are most important. So no worries about getting this wrong, of course. As we always say, this is just about having a go and thinking this through for yourself. So thanks for those who've put their initial votes in. So we'll give you a second to have a think about this. Let's see, I think we've had 4 people respond so far. I see many more are in Menti. We've got 94 of you in the Menti. So do please take part and have a go. As I said, no wrong answers, but it's always helpful for us to get a sense of what everyone's thinking so we can kind of discuss what's front of mind for you all. Right, so far it looks like the most popular options that people are selecting would be FastBite's approach to materiality, to the data that it already has available, and a lot of you have said mapping the value chain. So I think a lot of these are good answers. All of these could ultimately be relevant depending on the organization's context. The only one we particularly highlight would not be relevant or necessarily the right thing to be doing at outset for scoping would be gathering detailed data on FastBite sites and locations. This would probably be jumping into too much detail for the scoping phase, and you're going to cover that elsewhere in the LEAP approach. So the aim at this point is really just to get a high level understanding of how your organization interfaces with nature, who's going to be involved in the assessment, what your overall objective and approach here is, and maybe a bit of a sense of your value chain. What are the key business activities you have that are going to form part of this assessment? So I'll come to you now, Fiona, as well. If you've got anything maybe that you'd add here from your experiences working with companies on this topic.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, sure. So, as Tiff mentioned, the LEAP approach is an iterative process. Organizations, individuals running assessments really need to stay flexible and open to change. Rarely do organizations complete an assessment with the same scope they set out. There's various elements that obviously lead to this, namely realizing sort of data limitations, also potentially like capability limitations, and lots of other elements that really lead to this scoping process being updated, reviewed throughout the course of the assessment. When scoping, also really important to stay high level early on, as you kind of alluded to, and avoid jumping into the detail, as you said, not gathering super specific data early on. And then importantly, it's really good to secure senior management alignment early on. Having a champion early on in the process and a clear terms of reference really helps with carrying out the process. And finally, what I will say is when constituting your assessment team, really good to have a diversity of individuals from different teams to provide a diversity of perspectives, which really enables for a robust assessment to be carried out.
Great, thanks, Fiona, for those helpful additions as well. So I think that hopefully gives us a flavour of some of the key things to think about when you're starting by scoping your assessment. So let's move on now to look at the next, or potentially likely to be the next stage in the process for you, which is locate. So locate, as we've said, is all around starting to identify the potentially material nature-related issues that the company will focus its assessment on. So identifying what the issues are before you're then moving on in the evaluate and assess phases to work through assessing them. So this is where FastBite is really going to need to start to get a better understanding of its value chain and operating locations. So to help think about this, our next question for you is identify which of these business activities you would expect to be present within FastBite's operations or value chains. So again, there's no right or wrong answers here. Of course, we said FastBite is a made-up company, but you've heard a little bit about them already. If you recall, we mentioned they're a fast food company. They operate across North and South America with agricultural commodities supply chains. So have a think, if you were doing this assessment for FastBite and you were looking to map its value chain, which of these elements would you expect might form part of the value chain for the company? So I think we're getting quite a split picture here. Obviously, I see many people have highlighted that animal and crop production will be in the value chain. Of course, that makes a lot of sense. I think those are the ones that are really going to spring to mind. But I think what's interesting to see here is that many of the others, as someone has highlighted, could be relevant. And I think ultimately that's probably the message here, is that it actually is often only when you start to map out the activities that you really, as an organization, get a full sense of everything that comprises your value chain that could be relevant for this assessment. So, for example, it might take some discussion with colleagues or with suppliers to understand how things are being transported, agricultural commodities into your market. Are they shipped? Are they transported over land, for example? So the types of nature-related issue you might wish to assess, of course, if you're talking about ocean-related transport, would be quite different to land. So I think the key message here is just that you want to get a good understanding of what the overall broad components are that sit within your value chain. It might not be that you move forward with assessing all of these at the start, but just getting a sense of what they are to begin with is the key step here. So really, that's what we've had a go at doing here. So I think in the interest of time, we'll move into the next step, which is then to take forward and evaluate a few of these issues. So we've potentially mapped out what value chain components exist for Paspite here, and we'll move forward with focusing on a few of the key ones for the next stage of the assessment. So when we're in evaluate, which is the next stage the organisation is likely to come to, the focus here is really on identifying then potentially material nature related issues. So we've identified the value chain phases in the locate phase, so really located where the company interfaces with nature. What we now want to do is connect those value chain stages to the related nature dependencies and impacts. So let's have a look at what that could look like. So our next question is, if we think about four of those key value chain areas that we've talked about there already of crop production, marine transportation, animal production, waste collection and treatment, have a go at ranking. I know it's just a rough exercise here. How much do you think Fastbite's business activities would currently impact or rely upon nature in these areas? So if we take crop production as an example, you can use the scale that you have, I think, on your screen to let us know how much impact, roughly speaking, do you think that issue would have on nature? And then in turn, how much dependence does FastChain have on nature to provide that service? How much reliance is there on, ecosystem services, maybe on clean water, on soils, for example, on crop production? So you can have a go at ranking each of these issues. So of course, you're probably getting now that this is quite a simplified version of what you might actually want to do within your own organization. You would want to start to get into a bit more detail, of course, about the specific nature related issues here. But this is just to have a go at giving it a ranking. So thanks for those who are having a go. I see that so far, everything has come out in the top right quadrant. So maybe you all agreed that these are important value chain areas to think about, and actually reliance and impact on nature are likely to be quite high across the piece for the company. But overall, if we're looking at the right-hand scale of how much the business relies on nature, we see crop production and animal production coming at the highest, which I think sounds sensible. And then we're seeing for the highest impact on nature, potentially the waste side of things and animal production as well. So that's, I think, potentially also a very rational conclusion as well. And then what we'd want to do is to go away and really start to research and understand this a bit further. But I'll bring you in here, Fiona, if you've got anything to add on maybe what some of the underlying dependencies and impacts on nature you think might exist for Fastbite across these different areas.
Yes, thanks, Fiona. So when thinking about crop production, in terms of the kind of dependencies that might emerge, you'd probably think about pollination services, obviously to pollinate crops. Most likely very, very dependent on water supply for irrigation, and then also dependent on soil quality. And then in terms of impacts, Fastback will likely have a high materiality for land use to clear land for crops, as well as water use. Thinking about, for example, crops like rice or sugar require large areas of also fresh water and water supply. Then looking at maybe or thinking about animal production, similarly, in terms of dependencies, we'll be looking at soil quality. Obviously, we require healthy and fertile soils to provide production of animal feed, and very highly dependent on the provision of biomass, for example, grazing of cattle, as well as water supply. And then thinking about impacts, what might occur is a very high impact on land use. Again, clearing large areas of land to house animals and all the necessary facilities for pasture, as well as growing any supplemental feed and grazing. So just a few examples of dependencies and impacts that emerge from the activities we've identified.
Great, thanks, Fiona. So hopefully that helps to bring to life everyone there the types of things you'd be looking to assess and think about dependencies and impacts from. So really there, that's what Evaluate is all about, identifying those dependencies, how you rely on nature, and identifying how you impact and affect nature as well. And so after that, the next step for FastBite then will be to assess which of those issues it should prioritize in the assess phase. So assess phase is when we're really sort of starting to move on and think about the financial risks and opportunities that could arise from these nature-related dependencies and impacts. So we've understood the nature interface there and kind of the impacts, dependencies. Now we're connecting that to the real business risks and opportunities that we think could exist and thinking about the overall materiality of those issues, which ones therefore might need to be disclosed publicly. So we've heard in this training about different types of nature-related risks and opportunities, but I'm just going to show you quickly this diagram as a reminder before we go into the exercise. So you recall that TNFD defines nature-related risks as potential threats to an organization stemming from its dependencies and impacts. And there are sort of three main types of risks. There are physical risks relating to direct changes in the state of nature, either on a chronic or an acute basis. There are transition risks, which are around threats arising from society's responses to nature loss. So these could include policy and legal changes, maybe reputational damage. And then finally, we also have systemic risks as well. So those are risks arising from the breakdown of the natural systems as a whole and how that can then lead to cascading risks across markets and the wider economy. We also then have nature-related opportunities, which are activities that either enhance business performance, for example, cost savings from resource efficiency, or also those that improve sustainability performance by actively contributing to nature positive outcomes. So, for example, maybe ecosystem restoration. So, with that quick primer on what the risk types are, our next question then would be to have a go at assessing some potential risks for FastBite. So, you'll see on screen here a number of possible risks that we think could exist for FastBite relating to those nature dependencies and impacts that we've already talked about. So, you can use the scale there to rank how exposed you think FastBite could be to these issues. Simple scale here, of course. When you do the assessment, you probably want to think about different lenses like likelihood and severity. But if we have a simple go at just ranking from low risk to high risk, which of these issues do you think would maybe be most or least important for FastBite? So if we start at the top, we've got the acute physical risk relating to perhaps flooding or deforestation in the agricultural supply chain, which might remove, the health of soils, might increase flood risk. Sorry, then we have another risk actually after that, which particularly relates to soils. So, how important do you think soils and pollination are to crop yields, and how much would that impact FastBite in turn? We've then got some risks relating to policy, regulation, brand, and maybe technology shifts as well. So I know there's a little bit to read there, but hopefully helpful just to get a sense of what these types of issues could be. And really that in assess, you're looking to categorize and really show what those risks and opportunities are, and then get a sense of which ones you think would be most material. So it looks like soil degradation and decline of pollinators is coming out the highest on the rankings, as well as the risk relating to flooding. So basically those risks that directly connect to the supply and production of the agricultural inputs, because of course that's a really key nature-related dependency and impact for the business. And then at the bottom here, it looks like the lowest ranked option is maybe the need to adopt new technologies in manufacture because maybe you think they're not reliant to such a great an extent on technology. So thanks everyone for having a go at that. I'll just turn to you again, Fiona. Is there anything you'd add about assess or anything about how to think about these risks and opportunities in particular?
Yeah, I guess just keeping in mind that there's often close relationships between different nature-related risks, and physical and transition risks oftentimes interact with each other. excuse me. For example, Fastbite might be exposed to acute physical risk by its choice of suppliers and their connection to activities such as deforestation. And in turn, then these activities might then drive chronic risks like soil degradation that increase exposure to chronic risk. It might also drive transition risks through policy or legal risks or reputational risks if this is perceived negatively by customers. So just from pilot testing, some lessons that we learned is that organizations should really think about using a range of methods and tools to support their assessment and to get familiar with the benefits and the limitations of each one of these methods and tools that they are using. So just, yeah, a little food for thought. I'll hand back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Fiona. Really helpful. And so that's the third stage, assess. So now we're going to move into our final one, which is prepare. So prepare is really about deciding what to do next with the information from your assessment. So this could be engaging suppliers, integrating findings into your strategy, setting targets, for example. It's really about moving things into action and responding to those issues that you've identified. So let's have a look now at what that could look like. So this is just a quick question to wrap things up, but have a think about based on which issues you've considered so far in this assessment, maybe which risk you ranked the highest there in that last slide. What is one action that you think Fastbite could take to respond to or mitigate that nature-related risk? So there's going to be lots of different things that you might say here, of course, depending on which risk you identified as key. So just have a think of, off the top of your head, what might be one thing you think Fastbait should do? Maybe it's a direct mitigation they could put in place. Maybe it's something that you think that they need to go away and do more assessment on. Maybe it's something in their risk process across the piece you think that could help them to manage and assess all of these issues more comprehensively. Great, thanks. Whoever's come in with our first response here. So they've mentioned diversifying suppliers so as to reduce sourcing related risk. Yeah, maybe they've identified actually there's one or two key suppliers, for example, for beef, but actually, they need to build their resilience and diversify that supply chain and think about maybe operating regions or suppliers with stronger practices who might be more resilient there and reducing their impacts. So someone's mentioned that alternative sourcing, maybe thinking about cold storage to maybe manage how the supply disruption could cause issue. Someone said maybe they could apply nature-based solutions, so maybe that would help them with some of those issues relating to flood risk and soil degradation, for example. Great, thank you, everyone. So we've got water scarcity management to secure water. So yeah, maybe engaging their suppliers to understand what approaches they're taking on that at the moment. Try to guide suppliers perhaps on those practices where relevant. Maybe as well, they also have water risks in their operations as well in America that might be worth considering. Crop resilient investments. Yeah, so maybe that's investing in new types of crop production that draw on, crop science to increase yields and reduce resilience to increase resilience, I should say, to maybe pests or extreme weather. Lots of great ideas. So I think you well get the emphasis of this section, which is, as we say, about starting to really map out the actions that you can take to respond to the risks. And what you want to think about in this stage as well is how you would then prioritize a hierarchy of action that you take. So thinking about, the top priority perhaps being to get the basics in order and prevent negative impacts from happening in the first place. But actually, as your methods get more sophisticated, you may want to even be thinking more to that restorative and regenerative approach to nature, with a few of you mentioning things in that space with nature-based systems. So I'll just check our time. We're coming up to time a little bit, maybe. So I'll just come back to you very quickly, Fiona, as we wrap up this segment, if there's any sort of key takeaways on this or this stage or LEAP as a whole.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, there's some really good examples here. Just to point to the fact that we do have sector guidance, which provides also a list or examples of the types of responses businesses could take based on their sector. So it provides that sector specificity or that sector filter, which is really useful. And then maybe just zooming out a bit, just with some concluding remarks, just for organizations to remember that climate and nature are interconnected. And it's really important to therefore take an integrated approach when reporting. We'll expand on this a little bit further down the line. And just a key takeaway is that organizations should think to start with data they already have and really build on that rather than starting from scratch. So I'll hand back to you. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Fiona. Lots of great insights there. So that brings us to the end of that interactive phase. So we've used FastBite today to help us really understand the overall key phases of LEAP at a high level. So hopefully that's helped you to appreciate what those steps are and what kinds of activities would sit within them, and maybe as well sparked off some thinking about how this could apply to your own organization. Of course, the nature-related dependencies and impact, risks and opportunities for your organization may not be quite so obvious as FastBite. For example, if you're in a secondary or a tertiary sector, it could be that only when you get into really mapping your value chain that you can find that actually you do have more interfaces with nature than you realize. So really that's what LEAP is all about, helping you discover. So just to say, in the handout, you'll have a number of extra slides here that we've hidden in the presentation, which give you an overview of LEAP and some of the key elements so that you've got that as a takeaway as well. But let's move into the final segment of this module now, which is all around putting this in practice in your own organizations and taking forward what types of tools you could use to help you on this. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the key tools and resources that are available to support you on this topic. The main takeaway here is that there are a lot of different tools that you can use. The right one for your organization is really going to depend on several considerations: the sector you operate in, the biomes that you're interfacing with in your organization, and maybe how mature you are in your assessment as well. So there are simpler tools that you may use at outset, maybe when you're scoping, for example, and then there are, more sophisticated ones that you might build up towards in time. So there's no single right way to use these tools, but what's right is to review what's available and pick what's best for you. So we have an extra slide in the handout here as well, which sets out some of the additional factors that you might want to consider to help you select the best tool. I should also mention as well, if I go back a slide, sorry, we've got the link there to the TNFD tools catalog as well, which is a really good resource comprising a lot of this information. So that link is available in the handout and we'll share it with you as well. Thanks, Tiff. So just to prime, I guess, before we pass over to our colleagues at S&P for their presentation, a few of the key tools that are available and that you may wish to consider. So we're going to hear from Yusuf shortly at S&P about their global nature biodiversity risk data set and their nature risk platform and how they're using that to support companies in assessing these issues. And then as well, I think it's useful to highlight that there are other tools out there as well that you might consider. So another interesting one is the Robeco's biodiversity traffic light, which looks at corporate positioning on biodiversity, and it's focused on helping investors to identify leaders and laggards, but maybe also for companies as well to understand what does their current, disclosure tell investors at the moment, and how well do they perform against their peers. And finally, also, we'd mention WWF's biodiversity risk filter, which is a free online tool that corporates and portfolio managers could use to screen their different locations and assets for different types of risk as well. So just a few to give you a flavor of the fact that there are many options out there that can be used depending on your circumstances. But yes, as I said, I'm very pleased to have Yusuf here from S&P today, who's going to take us through a bit more of an overview of how you've worked with a company to assess their nature-related issues using LEAP, building on S&P's tools. So thanks, Yusuf. I'll just give you slide control now, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Yeah, so I think now we know theoretically and through the Menti exercise what LEAP is, and we want to talk through these phases in a practical case study. And so I don't need to introduce the phases too much anymore, but let's look at the case study here. So let me see. Yeah, there we are. Case study is about a petrochemical company who's conducting its first LEAP assessment. So it's a large petrochemical companies with more than $10 billion in annual revenue. And they have a footprint of 30 production facilities and plants globally. And so what are their objectives? Well, they want to get ahead of regulatory requirements that are upcoming, especially the EU CSRD, but they also just generally want to understand and quantify their risks. Now, first, we had a scoping phase. This is practically speaking before the LEAP assessment, so step 0. You want to decide what to focus on. And our focus was on the own operations of this company first. Upstream is a bit tricky because they source a commodity, oil, and this can come from anywhere. So we restricted this piece of the analysis to an upstream pipeline. Downstream, that's also tricky because they produce plastics, which go in the hands of consumers. So there's not really an easy methodology to apply. But at the same time, that's fine. So this is where we started. And as we heard before, it's not a one shot. You don't need to do everything year one. You can mature over time and develop your approaches. But for the moment, the primary focus is on the company's own operations. And we start with the first phase or first step, which is the locate phase. So here we look at an asset of this company, which is an ethylene production. And it's in the US and in the biome temperate coniferous forest. And the first step is really mapping out the asset. So we draw out the perimeter on a map, basically. So we draw the outline of the asset so that we all know what we're talking about. And that already tells us a couple of things. So first of all, we understand that there is no overlap with a key biodiversity area or an area designated as a protected area by the World Database of Protected Areas. We also know that this asset has water intake from the river and groundwater for cooling purposes. Then on the impact side, we can already sense, okay, there might be potential impact due to chemical pollution or microplastics. And just generally, there's an impact because of the land use. So simply just the land use for storage infrastructure, tanks, and piping, that by itself is an impact. And so in the next step, we want to evaluate the impacts and dependencies. And here's a couple of key questions that we ask ourselves with our methodology and our data specifically. On the impact side, we have 3 questions. First of all, what is the footprint of the asset? So the larger the footprint tends to be worse. Then we ask ourselves, what's the ecological significance? And finally, the environmental degradation. So specifically, on footprint, what is the land use and the land use change of my operations? On the significance of this piece of land, we ask ourselves, how important is this piece of land to species, but also to people and their well-being and economic activity? And finally, environmental degradation, we ask ourselves, how degraded is this environment? On the dependence side, we have a different view, which is we look at all the ecosystem services. Okay, so there's more than 20 that we look at, and they are important for a company's operations, but not all the ecosystem services are equally important to each type of operation. So for example, pollination might be important for an agricultural facility, but not so much for a chemical plant, where maybe the groundwater availability is much more important. And so for each of those ecosystem services, we ask ourselves, how relevant is this ecosystem service for my operations? And then how vulnerable is this ecosystem service at this location? So not theoretically, at this location, that's what we're trying to proxy. And the outcome of this phase is something like this, which is a sheet for this particular asset where you can see the impacts and the dependencies analyzed. So on the impact side, you see that there's a certain footprint, so 24 hectares in that case, and then the ecosystem degradation and the significance. The degradation is not too bad, but the ecosystem significance, that is quite high. So that's something that we want to look at. And why is that? Well, it's not because of the significance to species, so there's no protected species around in all likelihood, but the significance to people is elevated. So the ecosystem contribution metric, as we call it. So that's something that we will analyze in the next phase. On the dependency side, we look at the ecosystem services, and many of them won't be relevant for this industry or for this asset, but some are, and we see a couple of them elevated. So, for example, water quality is the highest scoring item. And so this is what we take into the next phase, and that is the assess phase. So we look at the top impacts and dependencies and ask ourselves, what are the resulting risks and opportunities from these impacts and dependencies? And that's an exercise in brainstorming informed by local stakeholders. And so the result of that could be something like this. When we talk about impacts, we could have the problem that there's effluent discharge of substances of concern over a limit. So basically toxic wastewater over the permit limits, which could impact local communities and fisheries. It could also be that air emissions are settling on local farmland and impacting the local farmers. And then we assess the risks, okay? So the assessment is ideally aligned with the company's risk management approach as it is and the thresholds. So for example, if we have this toxic wastewater situation, we could face an enforced shutdown if the pollutant thresholds are exceeded. And so then you can see here, this scores as 4 out of 5 on the financial impact scale. That is very company dependent. So a small company will have lower thresholds and the larger will have larger thresholds. And something here, so an impact could be a 1 out of 5 if it's like a $10,000 damage. A 3 out of 5 could be a $1 million damage, and a 5 out of 5 could be a $1 billion damage. Okay, so this is something that ideally is in line with your risk management approaches. And you want to assess this in close collaboration between the risk management experts of your company, but also site level experts that can really assess it. And yeah, I saw in the chat a question around severity and likelihood. Yes, you can totally do that. So I think the LEAP approach doesn't prescribe anything, but if you have these competencies in your risk management team to really understand how severe, how likely, and all that is, it's a good practice. So the same thing is then for the next potential risk, which could be community protests and reputational loss. So here again, different metric. So a 1 out of 5 could be a local news story, and a 3 out of 5 is a national news story, and a 5 out of 5 is an international news story or a global news story for a very long time that's in the media for a long time. So that's how you kind of calibrate this. And then the last one here that we have is regulatory tightening with stricter compliance limits, higher compliance costs, stricter limits. So that could be a moderate financial impact. Yeah, we go through one more. So the dependence on water quality. So this is not the quantity of the water, but the quality of the water. And what could be potential risks? Here, first of all, we could have negative impact on my assets. So asset integrity is negatively impacted. It could also be that I have reduced process reliability or increased operational costs. And again, we go through it. What could that mean? Well, for example, impurities could create corrosion in certain parts of my equipment that need to be then replaced more frequently. So I have a higher use of spare parts. It's not a big impact, but you want to monitor it. The much more severe impact is if you have an unplanned shutdown, cleanup, and repair if you have an actual leakage. So that can be a high financial impact, but also reputational impact. And again, this is something that you want to find out with your risk management experts, but also site level experts that really know what's going on the ground, and they know the specific circumstances there. And so once you know what the main risks are here, you can put them in your risk management register or your enterprise risk management register, alongside all the other risks, which can be operational risks, which can be climate risks, and so on. So in this case, the low water quality that could impact my equipment could be one of the risks. And then I define an approach. So, for example, what are my policies? I could update, or in case I don't have one, write a new water resource management policy. Actions could be, for example, that I upgrade my filtration system or I install particle sensors. And then the metrics and targets could be I could monitor water quality metrics or asset integrity metrics. So how much erosion at critical points do I have in my equipment? And lastly, I disclosed this in the TNFD logic, which is the 4 pillars. So governance is who is responsible for overseeing and managing this risk. Then what is the risk and its potential impact on me, my value chain, my business model? The risk management describes how the risk is identified, assessed, and managed. And lastly, the metrics and targets. So we indicated this already before. How do I want to measure this risk? And what targets do I set myself to address the risk? So yeah, that's pretty much it. This is one end-to-end leap process. And yeah,
Great.
back to Donna.
Thanks so much for that, Yusuf. I think if you didn't understand Leap already, I think hopefully that's really helped to show step by step what happens at each phase and how that could look like for different companies. So thanks so much for taking us through that, Yusuf. So to wrap up this segment, we've got one last poll question for you, which is probably just to reflect on what you've heard so far from our mentee exercise and from Yusuf's presentation just then. Maybe you've already started Leap and you already know the answer to this, or maybe you're just hearing about this for the first time. Do you have a sense of where you might see challenges for your company? Do you know which aspect would you think could be potentially challenging for you? And whilst you're responding to that, I'll just prime our panelists that I think what would be great now would maybe if you can think about maybe the key stage that's coming out here. It looks like assess and scoping are coming out as maybe somewhere people see the most challenges. Would you have one or two top tips that you would share with our audience about how you think they could approach that or maybe overcome any difficulties that you might expect them to see? If you do have any sense of your particular barriers that you're facing, feel free to share those in the chat as well, and we can respond to those directly. But let's end the poll there and we'll have a quick look at your responses because I think the picture's emerging and it looks like scoping phase. So, gathering all of that initial information to know how to get started and then assess. So, going through that risks and opportunities assessment and thinking about the business connection, maybe the two stages people think would face the most challenges. And maybe Yusuf, as you're on camera, I'll come to you first if that's okay. Any reflections on those points?
Yeah, I mean, scoping is definitely, important because you want to just know where you start. I think that you usually start with your own operations, but it really depends. I think that you shouldn't see it as a one shot, as I said. You start somewhere where it's, your hypothesis that it's going to be the biggest impact and the biggest risks, and then work your way towards other parts of the value chain and different parts of your company. And assess, yeah, that's not an easy one. That really depends on your situation, and you really bring together the intelligence of your company. You have the knowledge spread all throughout. So you want to bring in the local experts, but also methodological experts, maybe from the headquarters, and yeah, adapt the approach ideally to your existing processes in case you have good processes in place there, and just, treat it as another risk with the same professionalism, the same methodologies, and so on.
Great. Thanks, Yusuf. Lots of great reflections there. I think hopefully that's helpful for people. And Fiona, I'll come to you as well. Anything you'd add as we're wrapping this up?
Yeah, for organizations getting started, really essential starting points are deepening their understanding of fundamentals of nature. So going over what we've looked at today, familiarizing themselves with the disclosure recommendations as well as the LEAP approach if they do choose to undertake a LEAP approach. Getting internal buy-in is really important, as I stated earlier, from both the board and management. So we need champions. Nature needs nature champions. And for organizations to really start with what they've already got, they'd be surprised at the amount of data that's already out there. and just thinking about planning for progression and progress and monitoring, evaluating that progress over time. Again, recognizing TNFD does acknowledge that disclosure will increase over time. We have a great getting started guidance that we can share in the chat if it's not already been shared. And then maybe just touching briefly on assess, as Joseph said, utilizing existing frameworks, risk management frameworks specifically. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel, but really integrating nature into those existing processes is the most effective way to get underway with the assess phase. Back over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Fiona. And if you wouldn't mind sharing that guidance in the chat, that would be great because I just want to make sure I'm sending the right one to people. But fantastic. Thank you both. Great presentations and I think helped to bring things to life there well. So I think if you weren't already thinking about getting started on LEAP, hopefully this segment has really inspired you and helped to show you how that's possible. So big thank you, Fiona and Yusuf, for contributing to that. Great. So, just to wrap up this segment, then, from my side, a few key takeaways, really. So, some of the things I guess that we've talked about in implement would really be around kickstarting internal action. So, the key mindset to remember here is that nature requires an integrated and a holistic approach. So, coming at it with that perspective is really vital because it's going to build that right foundation for you to really embed these issues and support your company's long-term strategic resilience. Next, if we think about the recommended framework to really help you with that, that's where we come to LEAP. And today we've given you an overview of those 4 phases of LEAP. So this is really the recommended starting point to identify, evaluate, assess, and report on nature-related issues. So a reminder here is the flexibility. So LEAP is designed to be used flexibly and iteratively. You don't need to follow the phases in a strict order or to assess your entire organization all at once. It's really about getting started and learning as you go. And finally, there we saw LEAP in action. So Joseph helped us to explore how companies are using LEAP in practice. And we saw a number of different tools and data sets that are available in the market for you to use to help you conduct these assessments. So really the main takeaway here is that there are lots of resources out there to support you. You don't have to use all of them. You don't have to read every single one, but really it's a case of going to those hubs and links that we've shared with you, taking a look at what's in the slide handout, and really taking your first steps to get started on this and building your experience over time. Great. So that finishes up with our implement module, and I'll pass you over to Tiffany now, who'll get us started on communicate.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona, and congratulations, everyone. We made it to the very last unit, which is on communication, which is a key objective of most companies using the TNFD. So while it is last, it's certainly not the least. Let's leave the best for last, no? So in this unit or module, sorry, we'll focus on 2 key aspects. The importance of engaging Indigenous people and local communities across your activities, to identify, assess, and report on nature. And secondly, how to include nature-related information in your reporting to investors in particular. So let's start by discussing engagement. So as we have already started discussing throughout this workshop, nature is increasingly shaping business strategy, risk, and opportunity. And as that happens, stakeholder expectations are rising rapidly. So a wide range of groups now want clearer information from companies on how they impact nature, how they depend on it, and how they plan to manage nature-related risks and opportunities. These include, for example, regulators that are stepping up expectations around compliance, oversight, and transparent reporting. Also, policymakers that are focused on the public interest and ensuring that national economies remain resilient as nature comes under pressure. Also, Indigenous peoples are emphasizing cultural preservation, rights, and the protection of territories that are often biodiversity-rich locations. Also, civil society organizations are pushing for stronger action on environmental and social issues. Oops, our slides went backwards. Thanks, Fiona. And investors, of course, want to understand how nature risks could affect returns and credit worthiness and long-term value. I'm just going to move. Well, it's not letting me move forward, Fiona. Maybe there's a
Sorry about the tiff. I've just removed slide control to avoid any more
Thank you.
moves. There we go.
Great. So understanding nature and nature-related issues from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected community or stakeholders in particular really provides a lot of benefits to the organization. So I want to go through a few of those as we get started in this section. So some of the benefits are on the slide. That's not all the benefits, but I think some key ones that are important to listed companies is first and foremost meeting reporting requirements. So demonstrating a meaningful engagement and effective processes to consider the views of Indigenous peoples and local communities is in a company's processes is a requirement of various reporting standards and jurisdictional requirements. But even if it's not, the second thing there, managing issues, it helps to manage and respond to nature-related issues effectively. That builds on the next one on collaboration, because inclusive, respectful, and open collaboration with Indigenous peoples and local communities helps identify shared approaches, and it creates opportunities of value to the organization that contribute to the restoration and protection of nature and benefits these groups. So failure to meaningfully engage can also lead to significant risks and lost opportunities in engagement. So when we're talking about these particular groups, who should we be engaging? So there are numerous groups of people to engage with, depending on the organization, the sector, the geography. So let's just discuss a few of them. First, we want to make sure we're engaging with rights holders. This includes individuals whose human rights are affected, including the rights to water, to food, adequate standard of living, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This category also includes members of groups whose collective rights are affected, especially Indigenous peoples and local communities. There's also stakeholders, which includes, for example, financial institutions such as investors, their capital providers and insurers, governments, government agencies, policymakers, also regulatory authorities, also intergovernmental organizations, scientists, consumers, landowners, civil society organizations, and other business and communities, businesses that communities interact with in the same ecosystems as Indigenous peoples and local communities. Pardon me. So corporates need to understand which of these communities, which of these groups of people they need to connect with for their direct operations or along their value chain. Great. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. Perfect. So Indigenous peoples and local communities play a uniquely important role in nature-related disclosures because their lands host actually the majority of the world's remaining biodiversity. And importantly, their traditional knowledge and stewardship practices are proven to slow or even reverse nature loss. So the TNFD emphasizes that engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities is not only a matter of respecting internationally recognized rights, such as the free, prior, and informed consent, but also it's essential for identifying and managing nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So meaningful, respectful, and ongoing dialogue with these groups ensures that companies' assessments and disclosures are grounded in the local realities and that they incorporate diverse knowledge systems and help to avoid social and reputational risks. And this makes Indigenous peoples and local communities engagement central to credible and decision-useful nature disclosures. So the TNFD has produced guidance to support meaningful engagement by companies and financial institutions with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected communities for the assessment, management, and disclosure of nature-related issues. The particular guidance is built on established international standards and frameworks, particularly the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So I highly recommend making use of that guidance that we also introduced earlier. Oops, there we go. That's the guidance. Great. So Well done, everyone. We're now at the final unit of our final module. And in that one, we want to look at the investor perspective in particular. And to kick us off, we're going to come back to Harshal at JSW.
Yeah, so TNFD is a strategic risk tool to further strengthen the ERM programs which we all run within our businesses. So it is an exercise to future-proof our business. So with that thing in mind, while we engage with the stakeholders, please focus on translating nature-related risk into business language. Link ecosystem dependencies to cost, maybe downtime, our permits, our expansion plans and timeline, maybe financing. So, and one more important thing is TNFD is an iterative by design. So I think focus on materiality, then perfection when you start.
Great. Some good real life examples of how it can be used. So hopefully that kind of helps you to show why reporting to investors on nature is becoming increasingly important, and that other companies are already getting started on providing investor-focused disclosure. But now let's look at what this means in practice. And one key message we want you to take away is that you don't need to wait for mandatory requirements. So even if you're not currently required to disclose the nature-related information, every organization should really start to begin assessing its nature-related issues. Doing this early really strengthens organizational resilience, improves strategic decision-making, and helps companies anticipate those risks and opportunities across their value chain. At the same time, we are seeing clear signals that nature-related reporting will become part of mainstream standards. A major milestone was the IFRS Foundation's announcement that the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, will begin a standard-setting process on nature, building directly on the TNFD recommendations. Just to clarify, this does not mean there will necessarily be a new S3 standard, and it does not mean that the TNFD recommendations will simply become mandatory ISSB texts. But as we know now, the ISSB will draw on the TNFD's recommendations, their metrics, and their guidance to shape investor-focused decision-useful disclosures consistent with S1 and S2. It does not mean that nature is expected, or what it does mean is that nature is really expected to increasingly be integrated into disclosure standards and requirements. So now is the time to prepare for that. So now that we've explored why nature-related information matters to investors in particular, let's spend a few minutes on how to communicate this information effectively to that particular audience. So to help you do this well, the SSC developed a nature disclosure checklist. It's included in our model guidance on nature-related financial disclosures, so you'll find it in Annex 1 of the guidance, and thanks, Fiona, for sharing that in the chat. So when you're preparing nature-related disclosures, there are several important principles that you want to keep in mind. First, speak the language of investors. They want clear, decision-useful information about how nature affects enterprise value. Second, integrate this into your narratives. Nature does not sit in a silo, and neither should your disclosures. So we talked about how connected it is with climate and other sustainability and social issues, so it should be connected in your disclosure as well. Tailor disclosures to your jurisdiction. Different markets are moving at different speeds, and they may have varying regulatory requirements. Also, build trust through transparency and balance. So stakeholders value reporting that is honest, both about your progress and the challenges you're facing. And finally, use data effectively to support your narrative. So data should reinforce the story, not overwhelm it. So now that we've covered these principles, we're going to explore what they look like in practice, going through some different examples. Before I do that, I just want to give a quick disclaimer to highlight that as with all the examples in our training, this is illustrative only. So they're intended to bring the concepts to life, but they're not best practice templates per se. So every company will need to tailor its disclosures to its own context, materials, materiality issues, and approach. Great. So as we discussed, it's important that your disclosures use the right information and the right language to speak effectively to an investor audience. So to illustrate what this looks like in practice, here's an example from Teleri Bioindustries 2023 TCFD and TNFD report. So Teleri Bioindustries is a Nordic private asset manager that specializes in private equity funds that invest in industrial scale facilities and technologies in the bioeconomy and circular economy. So this means nature-related issues are closely tied to the long-term commercial performance of the companies that they invest in. And in this example, Teleri provides a clear summary of several nature-related risks and opportunities they've identified. And importantly, they also disclose the potential financial impacts associated with each of them. So one example they highlight is the increased risk of forest fires. They explain that forest fires can reduce the availability of key raw materials, which drive up prices and affect the profitability of certain assets. This is a good demonstration of how physical environmental risks convert into financial effects in a way investors can immediately understand it. So this speaks directly to a key principle in the SSE Nature Disclosure Checklist, which is companies should clearly link their DIROs to enterprise value. So other strengths of this example include pairing narrative explanations with quantitative ranges, also drawing on the recommended TNFD metrics, and showing how nature-related issues connect to the organization's broader resilience and strategy. And these elements help investors assess both risk exposure and management quality. Right, so another consideration when communicating to investors is that nature-related information should be integrated into climate and broader ESG narratives to show the interlinkages between these dimensions. So an important part of integrating nature into corporate reporting is making disclosures streamlined and concise across different standards, so users can easily navigate the information. To help us explore how this could work, let's look at another example here. This is from Ørsted, a Danish multinational energy company that has transformed from fossil fuel intensive utilities into the world's largest developer of offshore wind power. So here, Ørsted provides a useful example. They use a correspondence table in their annual report to show how their disclosures align exactly with the TNFD recommended disclosures, and where each item appears within the report, how to find it. So in case you can't read it very clearly, I know the text is really small. The table has the main themes or the 4 core content areas of the TNFD recommended disclosures on the left, and then the report, the section, and the page where that information appears in their public disclosures. This approach embeds nature-related information directly alongside other ESG governance and strategic content rather than treating it as a separate add-on, but makes it easy to find. This kind of mapping really helps report users quickly locate relevant information across multiple frameworks. The TNFD's engagement with market participants has actually shown, pardon me, growing demand for these correspondence and cross-referencing tables, especially to navigate between the ISSB, the ESRS, the TNFD, GRI, and even product certification standards. In fact, the TNFD actually issued a statement in February 2025 supporting the use of cross-reference tables and encouraging organizations to report against TNFD and other standards in one integrated sustainability report. Thank you to the comment. I'm glad you're understanding the content very well. I appreciate that. Now let's move on to meeting jurisdictional requirements. So another important point when communicating with investors is understanding the legal and regulatory context you operate in. In other words, you need to know the rules of the game in your jurisdiction, and those rules are actually evolving very quickly, so not always as easy as it sounds. So a practical step companies can take now is to map their disclosure to whichever requirements apply to them, which helps both regulators and investors understand your alignment. So even if you're not yet required to disclose nature-related information, every organization should still be assessing its nature-related issues. Nature loss can affect any business model, so understanding your dependencies, your impacts, and then your risks and your opportunities is simply good business practice. And of course, remember, even without nature-specific rules, many jurisdictions already require disclosure of material issues. So if your internal assessment identifies something that could affect performance or even your license to operate, such as, for example, like water dependencies or biodiversity impacts, investors actually have to know about it if you're required to disclose material issues. So the key takeaway is understanding your jurisdiction, mapping your disclosures, and assessing your nature-related issues now is really important. It strengthens trust, it improves preparedness, and it positions you ahead of rapidly emerging reporting requirements. Now, speaking about trust, as we build on the points we've just discussed, one of the most powerful ways to earn the confidence of investors and stakeholders more broadly is simply to be transparent. So really balanced, honest reporting goes a long way in showing that your organization understands its nature-related issues and is dealing with them responsibly. This also means being upfront about uncertainties. It's completely normal at this stage to have data gaps or areas where methods are still developing. Investors really aren't expecting perfection, but they do value clarity on what's known, what's still being worked on, and what assumptions you have made. So we can see this approach is clearly the example being used here from Ferrovial's integrated annual report. Ferrovial is a major Spanish multinational in the transport and infrastructure sector. And this lays out the core hypothesis behind their nature-related analysis. They explain how biodiversity and ecosystems link to the resilience of their business model, and they point directly to the methodologies that they have used, including the integrated natural capital assessment approach. And they also highlight how consultation with local communities has helped to shape their understandings of risks and impacts. What's especially helpful, I think, is that they openly describe the assumptions that underpin their analysis. So these can evolve as new information becomes available, but disclosing them now gives readers a clear sense of how they reach their conclusions. And importantly, if they change those conclusions later, they're able to justify what caused that. Maybe their assumptions have been proven differently, or something's changed that's led to a different conclusion. Just to wrap this slide out, this sort of transparency really should extend beyond investors. So organizations should also make sure they report back to Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other affected stakeholders in ways that are accessible and culturally appropriate, and clearly explain how their insights help to shape risk assessment, materiality judgments, and strategic decisions. Now, for our final example, let's look at how organizations can bring their nature-related disclosures to life using data. So numbers aren't just technical details. They can help investors really see progress and understand trends and compare performance over time. And when paired with a clear narrative, they become incredibly powerful. So this example comes from Manulife's Natural Capital Report. Manulife is a Canadian insurance and financial services provider. They have significant timberland and agricultural investments. And what they're showing here is essentially the carbon balance of their timberland, but presented in a way that's clear, well-structured, and importantly, decision useful for investors. So their calculation builds on three variables. First, the starting point, the previous year's total forest carbon store. Then any resource changes, which captures shifts in acreage or updates in methodology from one year to the next. And finally, the next biological change, which reflects the natural balance between tree growth and harvesting. So on top of that, they track how much harvested timber ends up in as solid wood with a long life, in this case, products that are assumed to store carbon for around 100 years. And each of these elements is reported separately and then combined to show annual carbon removals. So the result is a very clear picture of how Manulife is managing the nature-related dependencies, impacts, and opportunities within its timber portfolio year by year. I think what's especially effective here is the combination of the narrative together with the data. So a narrative explains the logic and the risks, supported by visuals and quantitative data that show that performance and kind of prove that point. So this pairing of very clear storytelling plus robust metrics is exactly what helps investors make better informed decisions and really understand how well an organization is really managing its nature-related issues. That's my last example, so I'm going to pass back to Fiona to wrap up this unit.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. So fantastic. That brings us now to the end of our very last unit. So we'll wrap up on this one before we move into closing out the session and wrapping up with some final resources and takeaways for you. So, firstly, engagement of Indigenous communities and local communities came through as a key theme in our Communicate module because it's a key part of meaningful assessment and management of nature-related issues. As we've heard, these groups are the original custodians of the land and they hold the deepest and most critical knowledge about the ecosystems that we all rely on. So it isn't just a matter of fairness, it's really a matter of success. Because if you skip this step, you risk getting your assessments and management strategies fundamentally wrong. And then the second point we heard was around getting ahead of the curve. Preparing your voluntary disclosures now is going to leave you best prepared for tomorrow's mandatory requirements. And as we've already heard, the regulatory landscape is shifting fast. So I know some of you have asked, how is TNFD to be used in combination with the existing need to adopt the ISSB standards? Well, really, what you should see the TNFD materials as is an important set of guidance and resources that can help you to meet those requirements. Because as we've already established, the ISSB standards would already require you to assess and report nature issues if the information is material. So you already need to be thinking about this if you're thinking about adopting the S1 reporting standard. And as we've heard already, more guidance and a practice statement as a form of standard is coming from the IFRS on nature later this year as well. So, really getting ahead of this now is going to mean you're not scrambling to get things in place when that comes through. You'll already have the robust processes and you'll be starting the right thinking and processes to report to that requirement. And finally, let's talk about a key audience for your disclosures, which is your investors. So, your information needs to be balanced, transparent, and speak your language. And crucially, as Tiffany took us through, you need to connect your nature strategy directly to finance. So, showing how your nature related risks may affect your capital allocations, your liabilities, and your strategic resilience. And so, really, by ensuring that that data is investor grade, so that's comparable and clear, you're going to really build the trust that you need to secure capital and demonstrate long-term stewardship. And so overall, if you use those 14 TNFD recommended disclosures of across the governance, strategy, risk management, and impacts metrics and targets areas that we've seen in our examples there, this is a really great way to structure your reporting and ensure that it really is doing exactly that and responding to your investor information needs. Okay, so we're coming up to our closeout of the session. I see all of our questions have been answered. So big thanks to Fiona, for Tiffany and Joseph as well for responding to all of your questions. Maybe I'll just pause for a second if anyone thinks there's anything that's useful to highlight from the latest questions that we've seen come in. I mean, I think I'd like to mention as well the perspective that was shared from, I think it was Yusuf Khan, relating to how this all connects to real on the ground impacts, I guess, in action. And I think what's important to see this as is an important piece of the puzzle and an enabler, but it has to complement other activities, of course. So the aim with using these kinds of frameworks and standards is giving everyone a consistent language that they can use, an approach to be able to assess these things. But also, what's really important there, of course, is that we then contextualize these things to the local context. So we can't just take a global framework and apply it globally. We have to really get down to our direct interfaces with nature, with indigenous peoples, to understand and assess this at that level. And really, by doing that, then a business can understand how well it may already be managing these issues and where perhaps the gaps are that need to still be addressed to reduce negative impacts and decrease dependencies. And so really this is what this is all about, is providing that transparency to enable companies to both assess that and for their investors to know how well they're doing that with that and engaging on them. Tiffany, I see you're on camera, so I'll come to you if you've got anything you'd like to add here.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I just had a quick flip through some of the questions, which are all fantastic. So really thanks everyone for contributing those. But something that came to mind when I was kind of looking at a high level of what they were discussing and questioning about is that, you know, obviously for some people, nature and particularly working in these ecosystems and understanding these ecosystems can be quite new. But a lot of the questions actually came back to risk management, which maybe I'll just remind everyone that your risk management teams are quite equipped to deal with risk management, but they might not know anything about the nature side of things and the ecosystem side of things. So just as a reminder, the extra guidance from TNFD on your specific sector, if your sector is already covered in those sector guidance, and the biomes that are looking at the particular locations and the types of ecosystems you might be engaging with really help you take it to that next level, and working together with your risk management team to use, you know, the practices and the processes they may already have in place, but now inserting this additional knowledge and understanding through the TNFD's sector guidance and biomes guidance can really help take it to that next level. So I really recommend using those guidance documents.
Thanks, Tiffany. I think that's a great point to finish on and highlight for everyone here. So, yeah, knowing that you've actually got a lot of colleagues who are already equipped with the right sorts of processes and skills to support you here, and may even be assessing these things, even if they're not calling it a nature-related assessment, is a really good point to highlight. Great. So let's wrap up then. So if you recall at the start of the lesson, we began with 4 key goals. And we really hope that now, as we reach this point in the session, you're feeling better equipped to explain why nature is relevant, from, you know, understanding your dependencies, impacts, and risks, and really thinking about how to connect that to your value chain. And we really hope as well that you've got a better understanding on the different tools that you can use to really support you, the different resources and guidance that are out there, and that you can be leaving here with a sense of, you know, some of the places to go to get more guidance and support to help you take this forward in your own organizations. But we know, of course, that there's much more work to do. So we want to get a sense now of how comfortable you feel at the end of this session on this topic, and hopefully we'll have moved things along a little bit. Actually, I remember now that we were up at the 7 and 8 on the scale before we started the session. So it'll be interesting for those of you who thought you were already well equipped on this topic. Hopefully, you leave feeling even more knowledgeable. But maybe in some senses, we appreciate that we might have opened up the scale of what there is to think about on this topic as well. So if that's the case, that's also very understandable. If maybe you've realized there's a lot to think about here, beyond maybe what you're already doing. But I see lots of people giving us a kind of between 7 and 10 on the scale now. So that's great that we're all feeling kind of confident to move forward on this topic. So we wish you all the best with taking that forward. So let's just share those results so you can see them. I see we've got about half of you responded, but yeah, eight was our top answer. So that's great to see. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so let's have a look then in our final segment. I think what's always helpful is just to reflect on what we've heard from today and what we think we want to take forward in our own organizations, because you've probably heard a lot in today's session. There's often things that need to be prioritized here. You may not want to do everything at once, or maybe certain points you feel are really pertinent or relevant to your context. So it would be great maybe if you could just take a moment to share with us one key takeaway, maybe more than one if you want to share more with us, to think about taking forward next. It could be a particular action you want to take, a particular type of topic or issue you want to assess, or maybe it's a particular resource that we've mentioned that you really want to go away and have a look at. But we know maybe setting ourselves a key takeaway, an action point, can be helpful to make sure we take this forward. So do take a moment and share with us that reflection. So we see someone mentioning the linkage of nature and business, so maybe you're better understanding that now. Someone has mentioned that environmental sustainability is vital for growth. Nature is interrelated to business. Someone else saying that they will download the sector guidance and relevant biome guidance to get started. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I see mention of doing your LEAP assessment and taking that away. I think that indeed is definitely something we'd really recommend. Starting to talk to your colleagues about the scoping side of things, and how useful it is to conduct these assessments. Thanks everyone for sharing those points, and do feel free to keep adding to that so others can see your takeaways as well, which I think is always helpful to see others working on this topic too at the same time. Great. I'll leave that question open for you, but we'll just go back and cover off our final couple of slides now to close out with some resources for you to take away. So we've talked about a few of these resources already, but I just want to recap for you some of the key places you can go to get more support. As a reminder, this presentation is available for you to download from the webpage for today's session. That will include links to all of these slides or materials that are linked in the slides you can follow as well. So the first one to highlight is the work of the SSE here. We've got our model guidance on nature-related financial disclosures, including that nature disclosures checklist that Tiffany just talked us through in the last module. You can also find the slide handout included on that page as well, the materials from the preparatory video, and finally we'll add the recording from today to that same page. So that's all there available for you to look at after the session. We've also shared a lot of valuable resources from the TNFD today, but a final point to highlight here is that the main materials that they have towards capacity building can be accessed through their Learning Lab and Trainer portal. So there's more modules that you can take away here if you want to dive into learning more about a particular training topic. Maybe you want to run a session to brief your colleagues on this as well. There's slides that you can access there to take this forward. And really all the resources we've mentioned from TNFD, including all the guidance, lots of case studies of people who've undertaken LEAP assessments or example of disclosures as well. So lots to look at on the TNFD Knowledge Hub there. Also from our colleagues at the S&P, you might have been interested to hear more about what they do on this topic. So if you'd like to follow up with the S&P team and ask them to contact you, there's a link available in the slide presentation here where you can request a follow-up discussion. You can also find a link to their page on this slide providing information about their services in this area. And just to show you as well, within this presentation here, we've included one summary slide for each of our training modules, which includes a list of the key resources that we talked about in that module. So I won't go through all of these now, but I'll just share that these slides are available for you in the presentation handout for you to go to as a resource. So, bringing us now to a very important point. A big thank you again for everyone who stayed with us throughout today's training workshop. We know that this is a long time to be together online and there was a lot to cover today. So, we're really appreciative of everyone who's asked questions throughout the session and engaged with us during this workshop. And as a thank you for that hard work, you're now able to receive your certificate for completion of the course. So, Tiffany has already shared with you in the chat the link to complete your survey, which will allow you to get your certificate. So if you follow that link, you'll find the feedback survey. If you take part in that survey and ensure you give us your correct name and email address, we will send you the survey at that email address. Just as a quick pointer, make sure that you use an email that you know doesn't have too many spam blockers on it, because sometimes our certificates do go to spam. So perhaps use a personal email address if you know that your corporate filters can be quite strong, and make sure to check your junk folder. We'll send your certificate out within a week of taking part in the training. So please be patient if you don't receive your certificate straight away, but we'll aim to get that to you within the next 5 working days. But if you have any issues accessing your certificate after that time, you can contact us and we'll be able to help you with that. So before we close, just a few final words of appreciation. First of all, a big thank you to all of the SSE's supporters. So this is a group of stock exchanges and organizations committing to action on sustainable capital markets and supporting our training work and making it possible. So as a reminder, supporters receive priority access to all of our training programs as well. So if you're not a supporter and this is something that you're interested in, maybe you're an organization working in this space as well, feel free to reach out to us at that link we've shared. You can get in touch with us via that page, and we'll be happy to share more details with you about that. But as we're closing out today's session, a few final thank yous. So, firstly, a big thank you to the Philippine Stock Exchange, the team, including Rich and colleagues who've supported us with our workshop today. And of course, a thank you to TNFD, to Fiona for joining us for today's training workshop. Thank you very much, Fiona. And to our guest speakers, Valentina and Joseph from S&P. And of course, a big thank you finally to our donors who've made this program possible, to the German government and to the UNDP. And lastly, but of course, by no means least, a big thank you for all of you as attendees for joining us today. It's been great to have you here with us in today's workshop. We'll hope to see you again at a future session and wishing you a great rest of your day. Great. Thanks, everyone, and we'll close off there. Bye.